Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ, and tonight we are going to sail. Yes, that's right. Not quickly, not urgently. There is no hurry in anything we are about to do. Tonight, we are simply going to leave the modern world behind for a while, the way you might leave a coat on a chair by the door, and we are going to walk down through the dark towards the sound of water. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day has just closed behind you, you can let it go. The lights can be low, the room can be still. There is nothing you need to remember from this, nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you will be tested on in the morning. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, that is exactly right. That is what this was made for. So settle. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, the way the sea finds its own rhythm when nobody is watching it. And imagine, if you would like to, that you are standing on a shore more than 3,000 years ago. The sand is still warm from the day. Behind you, somewhere inland, there are the last red embers of cooking fires and the low murmur of men who have not slept properly in 10 years. In front of you there is a ship. She is long and low and dark, her timbers oiled, her single mast lying flat along her length like a sleeping animal. Above her, the whole enormous sky is open, and the stars are out in numbers that no city on earth can show you now. This is the beginning of the longest journey in the Western imagination. Tonight we are going to follow it, slowly, from the smoking ruins of Troy, all the way home to a small rocky island in the Ionian Sea. We are going to walk through the real Bronze Age world that lay underneath the story, the ships and the harbors and the olive presses and the shrines, and we are going to look at what archaeologists have actually found in the soil. We will meet the monsters, and we will ask, gently and without ever pretending to certainty, where they might have come from. And through all of it, there is one man trying to get home. Before we push off from the shore, a few small and warm things. If you enjoy these long documentaries, if they help you rest, it genuinely does help the channel if you subscribe. That is all. No pressure, no performance. Just a quiet click that helps these journeys keep being made, and helps other people who cannot sleep tonight find them too. Sleep into Power is also available as a book on Amazon, in paperback and on Kindle, if you would like to take some of this with you into the daylight hours. And these documentaries are on Spotify as well, if you prefer to listen with your eyes closed and your phone face down. If you ever feel like supporting the channel directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee page, and every single one of those is read and appreciated more than you know. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what the time is where you are. It is one of my favorite things about this channel, seeing the comments arrive from every part of the world, all of us awake or half awake at completely different hours, all heading towards the same quiet place. So leave a comment if you would like to. Tell me your city and your time, and if there is a subject you would like us to explore, leave that too. Almost every documentary on this channel began as somebody's comment. Tonight's certainly did. Thank you to everyone who asked for this one, after we spent those long hours together beneath the walls of Troy. You wanted to know what happened to the man who thought of the horse, so here he is. Now, the wind is coming off the land, the tide is turning, somebody is loosening the mooring lines, and the ship is beginning, very slightly, to move. Let us go home. The war is over. You should understand what that sentence actually means. Standing here on this beach, because it does not mean what we usually think it means. It does not mean a treaty signed at a long table. It does not mean bells and celebration. It means silence, where noise used to be. It means that a city which stood for centuries on a windy ridge above the Dardanelles has stopped existing, and the smoke from it is still going up in a thin grey column that you can see from 30 miles out to sea. According to Homer, and to the traditions that grew around him for centuries afterwards, the Greeks took Troy by a trick, a wooden horse, hollow, left on the sand as an offering, men inside it. Gates opened from within in the darkest part of the night. Historians, it must be said at once, do not treat that as fact. Homer himself does not even tell us the story of the horse in the Iliad. It comes to us mostly in fragments, in the lost epics of the Trojan cycle, in later poets like Virgil writing more than 1,000 years afterwards, and in vase paintings. Some scholars have wondered whether the horse was a memory of a siege engine, since Assyrian battering rams under wet hides were sometimes given animal names. Others think it was a metaphor for an earthquake, since Poseidon was both the earth shaker and the god of horses, and since the archaeological layer known as Troy 6 does appear to have been badly damaged by seismic activity, and others think it was simply a very good story, invented because it was a very good story, which is a perfectly respectable thing for a story to be. What we can say is this: there was a Troy. That much is no longer seriously debated. It sits at a place in modern Turkey called Hisarlik, a low mound near the mouth of the Dardanelles, first excavated in the 1870s by Heinrich Schliemann and dug far more carefully ever since. Underneath it there are at least 9 major cities stacked on top of one another, like pages in a book, and one of those layers, Troy 7a, shows signs of violent destruction at roughly the right period, with hastily built houses, storage jars sunk into floors as though people were preparing for a siege, and bodies left unburied in the streets. Whether the man standing beside you on this beach was ever there, we simply do not know. But tonight we are going to walk with him anyway. Look along the shoreline. In the darkness, the beached ships go on, hundreds of them, their prows turned towards the water. For 10 years, this stretch of sand has been a city in itself, a strange temporary city of huts and tents and repaired timber, with its own alleys and its own smells and its own quarrels. Now it is being taken apart. Men are rolling ships down over greased logs into the shallows. Others are carrying out the plunder, bronze cauldrons, tripods, folded cloth, silver cups, and women who were somebody's daughters a week ago. Nobody in the ancient world pretended this was clean. Homer does not pretend it either. That is one of the strange, honest things about these poems. They do not look away, and they do not let the winners leave easily. The tradition is unanimous on this point. Almost nobody who took Troy had a good voyage home. The Greek word for the genre is nostos, the returning, and the returns were a catalogue of disasters. Agamemnon, the great king who led them all, would sail back to Mycenae and be murdered in his own house within hours of arriving. Ajax the Lesser would be wrecked and drowned. Menelaus would be blown south and spend 7 years wandering the coasts of Egypt. Diomedes would come home to find his wife had taken another man and would leave again for Italy. Idomeneus of Crete would be driven out by his own people. It is a remarkable thing, when you notice it. The greatest victory in Greek legend produced almost no happy homecomings at all. There is a moral in that, and the Greeks knew it perfectly well. The gods, in their telling, do not love men who go too far. Troy was sacked with a savagery that offended even the divine. Temples violated, a priestess dragged from an altar, a child thrown from a wall. The storm that scattered the fleet was not weather, it was a bill arriving. And there may be something historical hiding underneath that idea too. The end of the Bronze Age, in the decades around 1200 before the Common Era, was a genuine catastrophe across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Palace after palace burned. Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Ugarit, Hattusa, the great administrative centers of an interconnected world, collapsed within roughly 2 generations of one another. Writing stopped in Greece for 400 years. Trade routes shriveled. Populations fell. We still argue about why. Drought is one candidate, and there is now sediment and pollen evidence for a long dry period. Earthquake storms are another. Internal rebellion. The mysterious raiders the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. Most likely it was all of it at once. A system so tightly connected that when one part failed, the rest followed. Whatever the cause, the men on this beach were sailing home into the end of their own world. The kingdoms they were rowing towards would not survive the century. Perhaps that is why the story of a man who could not get home who wandered for 10 years while everything he knew changed shape behind him, felt so true to the people who first told it. They had lived through exactly that, but he does not know any of this yet. He is a broad-shouldered man of middle years, shorter than most of the heroes around him, with the kind of face that goes still when it is thinking. He is standing in the stern of his ship, watching the last of his men come aboard. 12 ships he brought here. 12 ships he is taking away. Somewhere behind that ridge, in ashes now, is the city he outwitted, and there is no sign at all on his face that he is proud of it. His name is Odysseus. He is trying to remember what his son looks like. The boy was an infant in a blanket when he left. The boy is 20 now. The oars go out. The water takes the weight of the hull, and the long, dark line of the Trojan coast begins, very slowly, to slide away. Let it slide. Let the sound of the oars become the sound of your own breathing, in and out, unhurried, the whole ship rocking gently beneath you. We have a long way to go, and we are going to find out who this man was before we sail any further. Every hero in Greek legend has an adjective attached to him, the way a coin has a face stamped on it. Achilles is swift-footed. Agamemnon is lord of men. Ajax is the bulwark. Odysseus is the man of many turns. That is the closest we can get in English to polytropos, the word Homer uses in the very first line of the poem. It is a wonderfully slippery word. It can mean much traveled, a man turned this way and that by the world. It can mean much turning, a man who twists and doubles back and finds another route. Translators have rendered it as resourceful, as cunning, as complicated, as a man of twists and turns. Emily Wilson, in her translation, simply calls him complicated, and something about that lands very cleanly, because he is. He is not the strongest man in the Greek army, not by a long way. He is not the fastest or the tallest or the best born. What he has instead is a mind that will not stop working, and a tongue that can talk a hostile room into agreement, and a capacity for patience that borders on the inhuman. He is also, and the poems are not shy about this, a liar. Think about how unusual that is. The central figure of one of the two founding poems of Western literature is a man whose defining skill is deception. He lies to strangers, to friends, to his own wife, to a goddess, and he lies so beautifully that the goddess laughs out loud with pleasure at hearing it. In a warrior culture that prized the straight spear and the open charge, the Greeks chose to make a hero out of the man who thought his way around things. Not everyone approved. Later Athenian playwrights, particularly Sophocles and Euripides, would portray him as a slippery politician, an operator, a man you would not trust with your vote. The Romans, who traced their own ancestry back to Trojan refugees, disliked him intensely. Virgil calls him cruel, deceitful, the deviser of crimes. Dante puts him in the 8th circle of hell, among the counselors of fraud, burning inside a tongue of flame. But in the Odyssey itself, that intelligence is presented as a survival tool and a kind of grace. So who was he in the world of the poem? He is the king of Ithaca, a small island off the western coast of Greece, and the surrounding scatter of islands and mainland shore. His kingdom is described with a striking lack of grandeur. Homer calls Ithaca rugged, rough, good for goats, no place for horses. It is not Mycenae, it is not Pylos. There are no chariots here, and no great treasury. This is a kingdom of stone walls, terraced hillsides, olive trees, pigs kept in the hills, and a few hundred families who all know one another. That modesty matters enormously to the emotional logic of the story. Odysseus is offered, at various points, immortality, a goddess, an island paradise, and a kingdom. He turns all of it down for a rocky little place where the wind never stops and the soil is thin. His father is Laertes, an old man now, who will spend most of the poem out on a farm in the hills, refusing to come into the town, working in the dirt with his hands, dressed like a laborer because his son is missing and he can no longer bear the house. His mother is Anticlea, His wife is Penelope, who we will meet properly much later, and who is quite possibly the most interesting character in the entire epic. His son is Telemachus, born just before the war, and now a young man who has never once heard his father's voice. There is also a dog. We will come to the dog, not yet, and underneath the family, Homer places one more relationship, quieter and stranger. Odysseus has a patron among the gods, and it is Athena, goddess of wisdom, of craft, of weaving and shipbuilding and strategy. She likes him. She says so directly at one point, telling him that they are alike, that they are both good at scheming, that she cannot abandon him because he is so clever. It is one of the warmest relationships between a mortal and a deity anywhere in Greek literature. But he has an enemy too, and that enemy is the sea itself. Now the harder question. Did he exist? Almost certainly not. At least not as a single historical man who did these specific things. There is no inscription, no tablet, no archaeological trace of a Bronze Age king of Ithaca named Odysseus. What we have instead is something more interesting and more slippery. Excavations on the island of Ithaca, particularly at a place called Polis Bay, uncovered a cave sanctuary containing a great many bronze tripod cauldrons, 13 at least, dating to the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era. That is significant, because in the Odyssey, Odysseus is given exactly such a gift of tripods and hides them in a cave on Ithaca. And in that same cave, archaeologists found a fragment of pottery from around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, inscribed with a dedication that appears to read to Odysseus. So there was a hero cult. People on that island were making offerings to Odysseus as a real and honored presence, centuries before Christ. More recently, a large Mycenaean building complex was excavated on the neighboring island of Kephallonia, and another substantial site at Agios Athanasios on Ithaca itself has been argued by some archaeologists to be a palace of the right period. But the claims are contested. Archaeology in the Ionian Islands is difficult. The soil is thin, the sites are eroded, and the temptation to find Odysseus is enormous and has led people astray before. What is fair to say is this: there was a real Bronze Age presence in these islands. There were real kings of small rocky places. There were real men who sailed east to the Anatolian coast and did not all come back. And somewhere in the 400 or 500 years of oral poetry between the collapse of that world and the writing down of these poems, all those men were compressed into one, and the one was given a name and a wife and a dog and a mind like a fox. That is how epic works. It is not history, it is memory, folded over and over until it becomes something harder and brighter than history, the way a blacksmith folds iron. He is standing in the stern of his ship as the coast of Asia disappears. He has been away from home for 10 years. He believes he will be back within the month. He is going to be wrong by 9 years, 11 months and change. Let us leave him for a moment, sailing quietly westward under the stars, and look at the world he is sailing through. Because the sea in this story is not scenery, it is the whole engine of the thing. Feel the ship first. She is not what your mind's eye probably supplies. Forget the tall galleons and the white sails of later imagination. This is a long, slim, shallow vessel, perhaps 25 to 30 meters from stem to stern, and only 3 or 4 meters across, built for speed and for being dragged up a beach at night. Her hull is made of planks fitted edge to edge, and joined with mortise and tenon joints. Small tongues of wood slotted into carved sockets and pinned, a technique so strong and so precise that Mediterranean shipwrights would still be using it 1,000 years later. We know this because we have found the ships. Off a headland in southern Turkey called Uluburun in 1982, a sponge diver mentioned seeing what he described as metal biscuits with ears on the seabed. Those biscuits turned out to be copper ingots, and the wreck beneath them turned out to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. She went down around 1300 before the Common Era. roughly a century before the traditional date of the Trojan War, and her cargo is a portrait of an entire interconnected world. 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, a ton of tin, which most likely traveled overland from as far away as Afghanistan, glass ingots of deep cobalt blue, the color Egyptians called the color of heaven, ebony from Africa, ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus, ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic, which had come the entire length of Europe hand to hand, jars of terebinth resin for incense, tortoise shells, murex opercula for perfume, weapons and tools from at least 9 different cultures, a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, one small ship, half the known world in her hold. That is the Mediterranean Odysseus is sailing through. Not an empty wilderness of monsters, but a busy, sophisticated, deeply connected commercial sea, where a merchant in Ugarit could order Cypriot copper and Egyptian glass, and a diplomat in Hattusa could write to a king in Thebes and expect an answer. Now feel the discomfort of it, because the poems are honest about that too. There is no deck to speak of, only a narrow gangway and some open space fore and aft. There is no cabin. There is nowhere to sit that is not either a rowing bench or a coil of rope. The crew of a ship like this, and Homer gives Odysseus around 50 men in each, sleep on the beach, not aboard. Almost every night, if it can possibly be managed, the ship is run up onto sand and hauled clear of the water, and the men make fires and cook and sleep in the lee of the hull. The sail is a single square of heavy linen on a yard that can be raised when the wind is behind. It is not much use for anything else. Bronze Age rigs could not sail closely into the wind, so when the wind was wrong, you took the sail down, stowed the mast, and rowed. That is why the crew is so large. 50 men are not 50 soldiers. 50 men are the engine. Now navigation, which is the part people underestimate. There is no compass. There will not be a compass in the Mediterranean for well over 2,000 years. What there is, instead, is an accumulated body of knowledge held in the heads of experienced men and passed down by voice, and it is formidably good. You navigate by land, first of all. The Mediterranean is generously supplied with mountains, and a sailor learns the profile of every headland the way you know the faces of your family. Cape Malaya from the south, the peak of Mount Ida, rising over Crete from 80 miles out, the shape of a particular island against the evening light. You navigate by star when land goes away. Homer describes it precisely. Odysseus, sailing alone on a raft, is told to keep the Great Bear on his left hand, which for a man heading east across open water is exactly correct. The Greeks called that constellation the Wagon, as well as the Bear, and knew that it alone never dipped below the horizon, never bathed in the waters of ocean, which is the phrase Homer uses. Orion rising told you the season. The Pleiades setting in November told you the sailing year was over, and it was time to pull the ships up the beach and wait. You navigate by wind, by the color of the water, by the direction of birds at dusk heading for land, by the smell of a coast, which is a real thing, the resin and dust and animal smell of an island, reaching you a mile offshore in the evening warmth. You navigate by the swell, by the way distinct wave patterns tell an experienced eye which quarter the weather is coming from. And still, constantly, men drowned. The sailing season ran roughly from the spring to the early autumn, and outside it, the sea was considered closed. The Etesian winds of high summer came hard out of the north. The storms of late autumn were killers. When Homer describes a squall coming down, the sky vanishing, 4 winds fighting one another, waves standing up like walls, he is not writing fantasy. Anyone who has been on the Aegean when the Meltemi is up will tell you that the description is accurate to the point of unpleasantness. So hold both of these things at once, because the whole poem lives in the tension between them. The sea is the road, it is the only road. It is how copper reaches Greece, and how olive oil reaches Egypt, and how a story told in a harbor in Cyprus arrives, 3 years later, in a hall in Ithaca. And the sea does not care about you at all. Somewhere out there in the dark, a ship is running west with a following wind, 12 of them in a loose line, the men resting on their oars, the water talking along the planking, and the helmsman, with his hand on the steering oar, watching the bear turn slowly over the mast. They will be home in a fortnight, they think. There is a coast ahead. In the morning, they are going to decide to stop. Before we sail on, let us step off the ship entirely and spend a day ashore in the world these people actually lived in. Not the palace, not the war, just an ordinary day in an ordinary coastal town 3,000 years ago, while somewhere out beyond the headland, a fleet is being blown off course. It begins before light. A woman is already awake, because the grinding has to be done before the heat comes. She kneels at a saddle quern, a slab of hard stone hollowed by years of use, and works a smaller stone back and forth across the barley, with the whole weight of her upper body. It takes hours to produce enough flour for a household, and it is one of the most physically punishing tasks in the ancient world. Skeletal analysis of women from Bronze Age and early Iron Age sites shows the marks of it: arthritis in the toes and knees from kneeling, deformation in the lower back and the arms. Homer knew about it. There is a moment late in the Odyssey where 12 women grind grain in the palace, and 11 have finished and gone to sleep, and the 12th is still working because she is the weakest of them, and she stops and asks the gods, out loud, for this to be the last day she ever has to do it. That woman has no name and appears for 9 lines and then vanishes. It is one of the most astonishing small mercies in ancient literature. Outside, the light is coming up grey over the hills, and a boy is driving pigs uphill towards the oak woods, whistling, half asleep. The bread from that flour will be barley, mostly, not wheat, because barley grows better in thin Mediterranean soil and tolerates drought. Wheat is for the rich and for festivals. The Linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos record both, along with figs, olives, and coriander, in quantities that suggest large-scale organized agriculture. Breakfast, if there is one, is bread and olives and perhaps a little cheese. There is no butter, there is no sugar. There is honey, which is precious and used in medicine as often as in food. And there is fruit in season, figs and grapes and pears and pomegranates. Meat is not a daily food. This is the single most misunderstood thing about the ancient diet, because Homer is full of roasting oxen, and it gives an entirely false impression. Meat in the epics is almost always a sacrifice. You do not simply kill a bullock because you fancy beef. You kill it for a god. You burn the thigh bones wrapped in fat as the god's portion, and then the community eats the rest, together, because that is what the ritual is for. An ordinary family might eat meat a handful of times a year, at festivals, and it would be goat or sheep or pig, long before it was cattle. Fish is eaten, though Homer is oddly sniffy about it, and mentions it mostly as a food of desperation. Archaeology disagrees with him. Fish bones and shellfish middens are everywhere on Aegean coastal sites, and there are Minoan frescoes of young fishermen carrying strings of mackerel. It was probably just too everyday to be heroic. And then there is the olive. It is impossible to overstate what the olive meant. It is food, it is fuel for lamps, it is soap, it is medicine, it is the base for perfume, it is what athletes rubbed on their skin, it is what you anointed a guest with after his bath, and it is what you poured over the dead. The Linear B tablets at Pylos record an entire perfumed oil industry, with named specialists, oil scented with rose and sage and coriander, produced in industrial quantities and clearly traded. An olive tree takes years to come into full bearing and can live for centuries. To plant one is a statement that you intend your grandchildren to be standing on that ground, which is exactly why Odysseus built his bed out of one. By mid-morning the town is properly awake, and there is a potter opening his workshop. He has a wheel, a heavy disc turned by an apprentice, and he is throwing a stirrup jar, the distinctive Mycenaean shape with a false spout and a narrow real one, designed for transporting oil without spilling it. These jars have been found from Egypt to Sardinia, which is how we know how far the trade reached. He works with his forearms wet to the elbow, and when he has finished a batch he will paint them with a slip of finer clay, octopuses, and spirals and running waves, and fire them in a kiln outside the walls that takes 2 days to cool. Down the street a smith is working bronze, which is the technology this entire age is named for, and which is fundamentally a story about trade. Bronze is copper plus roughly 10% tin. Copper is common enough in the Mediterranean, particularly on Cyprus, whose name and the word copper share a root. Tin is not. There is essentially no tin in the Aegean at all. It has to come from Afghanistan or from Cornwall, along trade routes thousands of miles long, hand to hand, at enormous expense, which means that every bronze sword in the Iliad, every cauldron, every razor and pin and cooking tripod depends on an international supply chain functioning perfectly. And that, incidentally, is one of the better theories for why the Bronze Age collapsed as completely as it did. Break the network and you cannot make bronze, no matter how much copper you have. It may be no coincidence at all that iron, which is harder to work but available almost everywhere, takes over in the centuries immediately afterwards. When the world stops connecting, you use what is under your own feet. At noon, everything stops, because it is too hot to do anything else, and the town goes quiet. In the afternoon, there is a wedding 2 streets away, and you can hear it. Music in this world is not background. It is functional, and it is everywhere. There is the lyre, the forminx, 4 to 7 strings across a tortoiseshell or wooden soundbox, which is the instrument of the singer and the court. There is the olos, a double reed pipe played in pairs, loud and nasal and thrilling, used for processions and dancing, and later, for keeping rowers in time. There is percussion, and there is singing, and there are songs for specific purposes. Work songs for grinding, songs at the loom, a harvest song that Homer mentions being sung by a boy with a clear voice while young people dance around a vineyard, wedding songs, and laments for the dead, sung by women, formally, in a tradition that survived in rural Greece into living memory. Towards evening, a man comes to the house with a bad shoulder, and this is where medicine happens. Ancient Greek medicine at this stage is not yet Hippocratic. It is a mixture of genuinely effective practical surgery, which the Iliad describes with startling anatomical accuracy, arrow extraction, wound washing, bandaging, the application of bitter root to reduce pain, and religious healing, incantation, prayer, and charm. The two are not in competition. In the Odyssey, a young Odysseus is gored by a boar, and his wound is bound up by his companions, and the black blood is stopped with a chanted spell, in the same sentence. The herbal knowledge is real, and much of it works. Willow bark for pain, which contains the precursor to aspirin. Silphium, now extinct, used for everything. Opium poppy. Wine as antiseptic and anesthetic. And a huge amount of it lived, as we said in Circe's house, in the heads of women. Now the sun goes down, and if there is a festival, the whole town is out. Because that is the other thing that gets lost. This world had an enormous amount of ritual and celebration in it, and the sacrifices and the feasts were the highlights of an otherwise very hard year. Everybody eats meat. Everybody drinks wine mixed with water from the great bowl. There is dancing, and there is athletics, and there are prizes. And at the very end of the evening, in a hall or a courtyard or simply round a fire on the beach, somebody calls for the singer. He may be blind, as Demodocus is, as Homer was said to be, because it was one of the few skilled professions open to a man who could not work the land. He tunes the lyre. The room settles. Cups are filled, and he sings about a war that happened long ago, and about men who are all dead now, and about a king trying to find his way home across a sea that will not let him. Somewhere out on that black water, tonight, a real ship is running west under the stars, and the men on it have not eaten since yesterday, and they do not know that in 400 years, people will still be singing about them. Look up before we go back aboard. The sky over this town has no light pollution in it whatever, and the Milky Way is a solid, bright river from horizon to horizon, and every single person in this town can read it. They know that when Orion rises before dawn, the autumn storms are coming. They know that when the Pleiades go down, the sailing year is finished. Hesiod, a farmer poet writing a generation or two after Homer, gives an entire agricultural calendar based on nothing but which stars are visible at dawn and dusk. They have no clocks, and no charts, and no instruments at all, and the sky tells them everything, and they trust it completely. That is the world Odysseus is trying to get back to, not a golden age. A hard, bright, physical world of stone and salt and smoke and starlight, where you know everyone's name and everyone knows yours. Now let us go and find him. He has just been blown a very long way off course. The first thing Odysseus does after leaving Troy is sack a town. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it does not fit the shape we expect from a hero's journey. There is no gradual descent into hardship. There is no innocence to be lost. Within a day or two of leaving the ruins of one city, this man and his crew put in at a place called Ismarus on the coast of Thrace, and they take it apart. Homer's own summary is brutally plain. They stormed the town, they killed the men, they took the women and the goods, they divided the plunder so that nobody went short. Odysseus tells this story himself, out loud, at a royal banquet, to his hosts, as an ordinary piece of biography. Nobody at that banquet is shocked. That single fact tells you more about the Bronze Age Aegean than any amount of pottery analysis, so let us stay with it. Raiding was not a crime in this world. It was an occupation, and a fairly respectable one. In the Odyssey, when strangers arrive by sea, the polite formulaic greeting includes the question, "Are you traders, or do you wander the sea as raiders do, risking your lives and bringing harm to others?" It is asked the way you might ask a man what line of work he is in. There is no implied insult in it. The Egyptians, who kept records, complained bitterly about sea-borne raiders. The Hittite archives at Hattusa refer repeatedly to troublesome people from across the water, and in particular to a place called Ahiawa, a name that most scholars now accept is a Hittite rendering of Achaia, the land of the Achaeans, which is what Homer calls the Greeks. There are letters, real letters, on clay, from one Bronze Age great king to another, complaining about Greek interference on the Anatolian coast. So the picture we get from archaeology and from the epics agrees. The Aegean was full of ambitious men with 50-odd ships and no strong central authority to answer to. And when the harvest was poor or the war was over or the season was right, they went and took what somebody else had grown. Ismarus goes wrong for the most human reason imaginable. Nobody wants to leave. Odysseus tells them to. He says so directly. He wanted them back on the ships and gone by nightfall, but the men have found the wine cellars, and there are sheep on the shore, and after 10 years of siege rations and sea biscuit and stolen cattle, they are sitting on a warm beach with meat and drink, and they will not get up. Meanwhile, the survivors have gone inland. The Cicones had neighbors up in the hills, and by dawn those neighbors have come down. Homer says they arrived as thick as leaves in spring, and that these were men who could fight from chariots or on foot, which is a small, precise detail that historians of warfare find interesting, because it suggests a properly organized society and not a scattering of villages. The Greeks fight all day with their backs to the water. When it finally breaks, they run for the ships, and Odysseus counts the cost as they row away. 6 men from every ship, 12 ships, 72 men dead, before they have traveled 200 miles from Troy, and the whole of it caused by a party that went on too long. There is a lesson buried here, and Homer does not underline it, because he never does. He simply puts it in front of you and rows on. Odysseus's men are going to die, all of them, every last one, over the next 10 years. And almost every death will happen for this same reason. Somebody could not resist something. A bag was opened, a door was tried, an animal was eaten. It is one of the quietest and most adult things about this poem. The monsters are not really what kills them. Away to the west now, into a rising wind. The men are subdued at the oars. Some of them are wounded. They call out the names of the dead 3 times each before they leave the coast. An old custom meant to make sure no man's spirit is left behind on a foreign shore. And their voices go out flat across the water and come back with nothing in them. Then the north wind arrives. Homer says Zeus sent it, a gale out of the north, cloud on the sea and cloud on the land, night coming down out of heaven. The sails split into rags. They take them down and row for the shore, and lie for 2 days and 2 nights, exhausted, not moving. On the 3rd day they set out again with fair weather, and the coast of Greece is close, so close, and Odysseus at the steering oar can very nearly taste it. And then, as they round Cape Malea, at the very southeastern tip of the Peloponnese, the current takes them. Anyone who has sailed there knows Malea. There is an old Greek proverb, still repeated by sailors well into the modern era, that when you round Cape Malea, forget your home. Winds funnel down between the mountains. The current runs hard. It is the point at which the sheltered coastal waters give way to the open southern sea, and in a Bronze Age ship with no sail and tired men, being caught there means being taken. They are blown south, 9 days. And here, at exactly this moment, Homer does something remarkable, and every reader who is paying attention feels the floor tilt beneath them. Until now, the geography has been real. Troy is real, Thrace is real, Cape Malea is real, and you can go and stand on it tomorrow. And then the wind takes this ship past that headland, and the map simply stops. For the next several years, wherever Odysseus goes, no one has ever been able to find it. We have sailed off the edge of the known world. Let that be a lovely feeling, rather than a frightening one. Let the last recognizable headland slide away behind you, into the haze. There is only water now, in every direction, and a sky with no landmarks in it, and a small wooden ship being carried somewhere nobody can name. 9 days of that. On the 10th there is land. It is a green shore, and there is nobody hostile on it. That, after Ismarus, must feel like a gift. They put in for water, which is always the first necessity, and Odysseus sends 3 men inland to find out who lives here. They do not come back. What happens to them is one of the most quietly unsettling episodes in all of ancient literature, precisely because nothing violent happens at all. The people they meet do not attack them. They do not imprison them. They are, in Homer's telling, perfectly friendly. They simply offer the 3 sailors some of what they themselves eat, a flowering fruit they call the lotus, and the men eat it. And that is the end of them. They do not want to go home. They do not want to leave. They do not want anything. All thought of the ships, of Ithaca, of the wives and children they have not seen for 10 years, simply dissolves like sugar in warm water. Homer says they wish to stay there among the lotus eaters, feeding on the flower, and to forget the journey home. Odysseus has to drag them back, physically drag them, weeping, and tie them under the rowing benches, and get the ships off the beach before anyone else goes ashore. Weeping, that detail is exquisite and horrible. They are not grateful to be rescued. They are grieving for what they have been taken away from. So what was the lotus? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that ancient writers were arguing about it long before we were. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, describes a people on the North African coast, in what is roughly modern Libya and Tunisia, whom he calls the lotophagoi, the lotus eaters, and he says quite matter-of-factly that they live on the fruit of a tree, which is about the size of a mastic berry, and sweet as a date, and that they also make wine from it. Polybius later located them on the island of Jerba, off Tunisia, and Gerber has been arguing that it is the island of the lotus eaters ever since, which is excellent for tourism. The plant Herodotus describes is probably Ziziphus lotus, the jujube, a thorny shrub that does grow across North Africa, produces a small sweet fruit, and can indeed be fermented. It is not narcotic. It will not make you forget your family. It is, disappointingly, just quite a nice fruit. Other candidates have been proposed over the centuries, with varying degrees of seriousness. The blue lotus of Egypt, Nymphaea caerulea, does appear constantly in Egyptian art, in what look very much like ritual and celebratory contexts, and modern analysis suggests it contains mild psychoactive compounds, apomorphine and nuciferine, which may produce a gentle sedative euphoria. Opium poppies were certainly known in the Bronze Age Aegean. There is a famous terracotta figure from Gazi in Crete, the so-called poppy goddess, dating to around 1250 before the Common Era, wearing a crown of 3 poppy capsules with vertical incisions on them, the very incisions you make to harvest opium. There are Cypriot juglets shaped unmistakably like an inverted poppy pod, found across the eastern Mediterranean, and residue analysis on some of them has detected opium alkaloids. So the Bronze Age world did know about substances that take away pain and care, and the passage of time. Homer himself mentions one directly, elsewhere in the Odyssey, a drug called nepenthe that Helen puts in the wine in Sparta, a drug that removes grief and anger, and he says pointedly that she got it from Egypt, where the soil produces the most drugs of anywhere on Earth. But I think chasing the pharmacology misses what the episode is actually about, and it is worth saying plainly, because it is the first real test of the whole journey. This is the first island. It is deliberately the first. Everything that comes after will threaten Odysseus's body. Giants, whirlpools, storms, monsters. This one threatens something stranger. It offers to take away the wanting, because that is what the lotus does. It does not harm you. It makes you content, permanently, immediately, with wherever you happen to be standing. And Homer, who understood people extremely well, saw that this is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a traveler, and possibly to anyone. Not pain, not fear, comfortable forgetting. There is a reason this word entered our languages. To eat the lotus. Tennyson wrote a great sinuous poem about it, in which the mariners argue, quite persuasively, that they should stay, that there is no joy but calm, that surely slumber is more sweet than toil. The frightening thing about the argument is that they are not obviously wrong. Odysseus does not answer the argument. He does not debate it. He simply does not let anyone else go ashore, which is perhaps the only sane response. Notice, as we row away, that not one of these men was hurt. Notice that they are crying. Notice that whatever Odysseus is protecting is not their happiness, because they were happy, but something else, something he cannot quite name, that he thinks is worth more than being happy. And notice, if you like, how easy the beach looks from out here. Green, warm, perfectly quiet. Someone standing at the water's edge with a handful of fruit and no idea why anyone would want to leave. Let it go by. There is a heavier darkness ahead, and a cave in a hillside, and the first of the real monsters. There is fog on the water when they find the next place, and it is not one island but 2. Homer is unusually careful about the geography here, and the care is the point. There is a small wooded island lying just offshore, uninhabited, thick with wild goats, with a good harbor and a spring, and soft meadows and soil that would grow anything. And there is a larger land beyond it where the smoke rises. And Odysseus, describing it years later, does something extraordinary. He gives a sort of estate agent's assessment of the little island. He observes that it has never been cleared or ploughed, that it would support vines, that there is grain land there, that the harbor needs no mooring stones because a ship can lie safe in it without cables. And he explains why nobody has done any of this. The people opposite have no ships. They have no shipwrights. They cannot cross the water, and so the island simply sits there, unused, for want of a boat. You are listening, in that passage, to a colonist. Historians have made a great deal of this, and rightly. The Odyssey was taking its final shape in the 8th century, before the Common Era, and the 8th century is precisely when Greeks began pouring outwards across the Mediterranean in one of the great migrations of the ancient world. They planted cities in Sicily, in southern Italy, along the Black Sea, in North Africa, in southern France, Syracuse, Naples, Marseille, Byzantium, all of them Greek foundations from this movement. And when a scouting party arrived off an unknown coast, this is exactly the assessment they made. Is there fresh water? Is there a defensible harbor? Is the soil good? Who lives there, and can they reach us? So the Cyclopes episode is not just a monster story. It is, among other things, a story about meeting people who are not like you, told by a culture that was in the middle of doing a great deal of that. And what makes them not like you is very specific. Homer lists it precisely, and none of it is about the eye. They have no assemblies and no laws. They do not plant or plow. They live in caves in the high hills. Each man lays down rules for his own wife and children, and cares nothing at all for his neighbors. They have no ships, and no craft of shipbuilding, and therefore no trade, no contact, no exchange. Every single item on that list is a negative of Greek civilization. The Greeks defined themselves by the assembly, the shared meal, the cultivated field, the ship, and above all by xenia, the sacred obligation of hospitality between host and guest. The Cyclopes are what you get when you subtract all of that. They are not evil, they are simply alone, each in his own cave, with his own sheep, answering to nobody. Odysseus takes 12 men and goes across. He takes a goat skin of wine as well, an extraordinarily strong dark wine given to him by a priest of Apollo, so strong that it was normally cut with 20 parts of water. He says himself, telling the story afterwards, that he had a feeling, that he sensed he was about to meet a man of great strength, savage, knowing nothing of justice. He goes anyway. Of course he does. He wants to see. What happens in that cave you probably know in outline. They find it empty, full of cheeses and pens of lambs and kids, and racks of drying curd. An impressively well-managed dairy operation. His men want to take what they can carry and run. Odysseus refuses, because he wants to meet the owner and receive a guest gift, which was the custom. The owner comes home at dusk with his flock, rolls a stone across the entrance that 22 four-wheeled wagons could not shift, and asks who they are. And when Odysseus appeals to the law of hospitality, invoking Zeus who protects strangers, Polyphemus laughs at him and says the Cyclopes care nothing for Zeus. Then he eats 2 of the men. I am not going to linger on the horror of the next 2 days, because this is not that kind of night. What matters for us is the escape, and the escape is pure Odysseus, and it turns entirely on a joke. He cannot kill the giant while they are trapped, because only the giant can move the stone. So he gets him drunk, on that unwatered wine, cup after cup, and when the Cyclops asks his name, he says, "Nobody. My name is Nobody. That is what my mother and father and all my companions call me." They blind him while he sleeps, with a stake of olive wood hardened in the fire, driven and turned like a shipwright's drill, and the giant screams, and the other Cyclopes come running to the mouth of the cave in the dark and shout in, asking who is hurting him, and he tells them, "Nobody is killing me." So they go away again, and tell him that if nobody is hurting him, then it must be a sickness sent from Zeus, and he should pray about it. It is a pun. In Greek it is even better than in English, because the word he uses, autis, meaning nobody, shifts in the other Cyclopes' reply into metis, another word for nobody, which is also the word for cunning intelligence. The trap is built out of language itself. It is the single most Odyssean moment in the entire poem. He escapes not with a sword, but with a syllable. Then, out under the sheep, each man bound beneath the belly of a ram, while the blinded giant sits at the cave mouth running his hands over their backs as they file out into the morning. And then Odysseus makes his mistake. Safely offshore, safely away, he cannot resist. He stands up in the stern and shouts back at the shore, and not just a taunt. He gives his name, his real name, his father's name, his island, his address, everything a man would need to curse him properly, because he wants the credit. And so Polyphemus lifts his hands and prays to his father, and his father, unfortunately for everyone aboard that ship, is Poseidon, and the prayer is granted. Let him come home late, and in a bad way, having lost all his companions, in a ship that is not his own, and let him find trouble in his house. Every word of that prayer comes true, all of it. That is now the plot of the entire remaining poem. He escaped the cave with cleverness, and doomed himself with vanity, in the space of about 4 minutes. Now, where might a one-eyed giant come from? The most enjoyable theory, and it is genuinely a serious one, was proposed by the Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel in 1914. The Mediterranean islands, Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, Malta, were once home to dwarf elephants, an evolutionary consequence of island living. Their skulls are frequently found in caves, and a dwarf elephant skull is a very odd object. It is roughly the size of a human head and shoulders combined, and in the center of the forehead, exactly where you would expect an eye socket, is the enormous single opening of the nasal cavity, where the trunk attached. The actual eye sockets are small and set far back at the sides, and are easy to miss in a weathered specimen. So the suggestion is that ancient people, finding these skulls in caves, reconstructed the animal they belonged to as a huge, single-eyed, roughly humanoid giant, living in caves, which is where the bones were. It is not proven, and it cannot be, but it is a lovely piece of thinking, and it belongs to a wider and very well evidenced idea, argued at length by the historian Adrian Mayer, that a great deal of ancient monster lore is fossil interpretation. The griffin may owe something to Protoceratops skeletons in the Gobi, giant bones displayed in Greek temples as the relics of heroes were, in several documented cases, almost certainly mammoth or mastodon. There are other explanations for the Cyclopes, of course. Some point to the physical reality of blacksmiths, who in some traditions wore a single eye patch to preserve the vision in one eye against sparks, and who in Greek myth were connected to the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. Some point to the vast unmortared walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, made of stones so large that later Greeks, arriving in a poorer age and unable to imagine how men had lifted them, said that Cyclopes must have built them. That word is still the technical term. Archaeologists still say Cyclopean masonry, and some, myself included on a quiet night, think that a story about a huge, stupid, immensely strong thing that traps you in the dark did not need any inspiration at all. We have all met that dream. Away now, into open water, with 2 ships' worth of grief, and a god newly and personally offended. The sea ahead of them looks completely calm. For a little while, everything goes right. They come to a floating island, ringed with a wall of bronze and a sheer cliff face, and on it lives a man named Aeolus, with his wife and his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, who have married one another and live together in a perpetual, prosperous, slightly unnerving feast. Aeolus is described as dear to the immortal gods, and he has been given the stewardship of the winds, and he is generous. He keeps Odysseus for a whole month, listening to the story of Troy, and when it is time to go, he does something wonderful. He takes the hide of a 9-year-old ox, and into it he puts every wind that blows except the west wind. He ties it shut with a silver cord, and stows it aboard the ship himself. And then he sets the west wind blowing, gently, steadily, at their backs. That is the answer to everything. That is a guaranteed passage home. 9 days they run before it. 9 days and 9 nights. And Odysseus holds the steering oar himself the entire time, sleeping not at all, letting no other man touch it, because he does not trust anyone else with this. On the 10th day they see Ithaca. They see it. Homer says they came so close that they could see men on the shore tending their fires. And Odysseus, who has not slept for 9 days, finally, with home in sight and nothing left to go wrong, closes his eyes. You know what happens. The crew have been watching that bag for a fortnight. They have decided, in the way that exhausted, resentful men do, that it must be gold and silver, gifts from Aeolus, that the captain intends to keep for himself. And here is a detail that Homer includes with real understanding of how people work. One of them says, out loud, "Look how he is loved everywhere he goes. Look at the plunder he is taking home from Troy. And we who did exactly the same work are going home with empty hands." They untie the silver cord. Every wind in the world comes out at once. The ships are picked up and hurled back the way they came, past everything, all 9 days of it undone in a single scream of air. And Odysseus wakes to find home vanishing over the horizon behind him. He considers, and he says this himself, quite plainly, going over the side. He thinks about simply stepping off the ship and letting it end. Then he decides instead to lie down, cover his head with his cloak, and endure. That is a real moment. It is easy to sail past it, because the next thing that happens is more dramatic, but pause on it. The cleverest man in the world offered a gift that could not fail, undone by his own inability to trust anyone else enough to share the watch. If he had told them what was in the bag, nothing would have happened. They are blown all the way back to Aeolus, and here the poem shows its teeth. Odysseus goes ashore, alone, and begs, and Aeolus, who fed him for a month, throws him out. "Get out," he says. "Get away from this island at once, you most contemptible of living things. It is not lawful for me to help a man the blessed gods hate. There is no second chance in this world. Fortune does not come round twice. Now, is there anything real underneath the wind bag? Wind gods are everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean, which is unsurprising in a sea where wind was the difference between arriving and drowning. The Greeks named the 4 principal winds and gave them characters. Boreas from the north, cold and violent, who was actually thanked by the Athenians with a shrine after a storm wrecked a Persian fleet. Notus from the south, bringing late summer storms. Eurus from the east, and Zephyrus from the west. The gentle one, the wind of spring, the wind Aeolus, lets Odysseus keep. The practice of binding winds is real folklore too, and remarkably widespread. Sailors in the Baltic and in Scotland and in Finland bought knotted cords from wise women well into the modern era, cords in which winds were said to be tied. Untie the first knot for a breeze, the second for a strong wind. Never, ever untie the third, which is to say, the story of a sailor given a bag of wind, who opens it at the wrong moment, is not a Greek invention. It is a thing sailors everywhere have told one another, for as long as there have been sailors, and there have been knots. As for the floating island with the bronze wall, ancient and modern writers alike have pointed at the Aeolian Islands off the north coast of Sicily, which still bear the name. Stromboli among them has been erupting more or less continuously for 2,000 years, a mountain of fire in the sea that sailors used as a lighthouse. Lipari has cliffs that shine. If you were coasting past those islands at night, seeing a glow on the water and a wall of pale rock, and hearing the wind funnel between the peaks, you might well believe that the winds were kept there, and so they row away from the one man who could have helped them, into a windless sea, and this time there is no gift, and no sail, and no help. 6 days they row, 6 days of nothing but the creak of the oars. On the 7th, they come to a harbor with high cliffs on either side, and a very narrow mouth, still as a pond inside, and every ship in the fleet rows straight in, and moors together in the calm water. Every ship but one. Odysseus, for reasons he does not explain, ties his own ship up outside, on the rock at the entrance. Rest here for a moment, in that quiet harbor, in the last hour before it happens. The water is completely flat. There is no wind at all. The cliffs go up on either side, and the sky above is a narrow band of stars, and it is so peaceful in there that men are already lying down along the benches to sleep. The land is called Telepilis, and Homer gives it one detail so strange that scholars have been chewing on it for 200 years. He says that the paths of night and day are close together there, that a man who could go without sleep could earn double wages, herding cattle by day and sheep by night, because the nights are so short. That is a description of high-latitude summer. It is one of the very few moments in ancient Greek literature that seems to reach towards something a Mediterranean sailor could never have seen for himself. Some scholars have taken it as evidence of amber trade knowledge, filtering down from the far north, second- and third-hand accounts of a place where the sun barely sets, arriving in Greece along the same routes that brought Baltic amber to Mycenae. We know that amber did arrive because it is in the shaft graves. Others have suggested it is simply a poetic way of saying the place was uncanny, a land at the edge of things where the ordinary rules of time had loosened. Others still connect it to the tradition of the Cimmerians, a people Homer places at the edge of the world in permanent fog. We cannot know, but it is worth noticing that the poem, at this exact point, is telling you that you have gone somewhere very far outside the world. 3 men are sent to find out who lives here. They meet a girl drawing water at a spring outside the town, a completely ordinary domestic image, the sort of scene you would find at any Greek well, at any hour of any morning. She is the daughter of the king. She points them politely to her father's house. Inside they find her mother, and Homer says only that she was as huge as a mountain peak, and that the sight of her filled them with horror. Her husband, Antiphates, seizes one of the 3 and prepares him for dinner immediately. The other 2 run. What follows is the worst disaster of the entire voyage, and it is over in about 30 lines. The Laestrygonians come, thousands of them, not like men but like giants, and they line the tops of those beautiful sheltering cliffs on both sides of that beautiful narrow harbor, and they begin to throw boulders down onto the ships packed motionless in the water below. There is no room to turn. There is no wind. There is no way out except back through a channel now under bombardment. The men are speared in the water like fish. 11 ships, every man aboard them. Odysseus, whose ship is tied up outside on the open rock, cuts his mooring cable with his sword and screams at his crew to row, and they get out, and they are the only ones who do. 540-odd men left Troy with him. Roughly 45 remain. He does not describe his feelings. Homer very rarely tells you what Odysseus feels at moments like this. He says only that they rowed on, glad to have escaped death, grieving for the friends they had lost. Those 2 states, side by side in one sentence, with no attempt to reconcile them. The instinct to seek the safe harbor was correct. Every instinct those men had was correct. The still water, the shelter from the wind, the enclosed anchorage, all of it was exactly what you look for, and it was the trap. There is nothing to learn from that. Some things are simply how the sea behaves. Where was it? Thucydides and others placed the Laestrygonians in Sicily. Later Roman tradition, oddly, put them at Formia on the Italian coast, and a Roman noble family there rather grandly claimed descent from the giant king. If you want a real location for that harbor, the most persuasive candidate is Bonifacio in Corsica, where a long narrow inlet runs into towering white limestone cliffs, and a ship inside it really would be completely helpless to anyone standing on the rim. But it hardly matters. What the episode is for is subtraction. The poem needs Odysseus to be alone eventually, and it is beginning to strip him down. One ship now, rowing away from that harbor in the strange short northern night, with the noise still audible behind them for a long time. They go east, and they find another island, Atia. Even the name sounds like a sigh. They come ashore and lie on the beach for 2 days and 2 nights, without moving, eating nothing, saying nothing, worn down to almost nothing by grief and exhaustion. That is a genuinely modern piece of psychological observation, and it is 3,000 years old. On the 3rd day, Odysseus takes his spear and climbs a rock to look, and he sees smoke rising from a house in a wood in the middle of the island. He does not go straight there. He has learned something at last. He goes back to the ship, and on the way he kills a great stag at a stream and carries it back across his shoulders with its feet lashed to a rope, and they eat for the first time in days and sleep on the sand. Only in the morning does he tell them about the smoke. They weep when he tells them. They remember the Cyclopes, they remember the giants. And Odysseus divides them into 2 parties by drawing lots, and the lot falls to a man called Eurylochus, who takes 22 men inland, while Odysseus waits with the rest. They find a house of polished stone in a clearing, and around it, moving through the trees, are wolves and mountain lions who do not attack, but fawn on them like dogs, rising on their hind legs, wagging their tails. The men are utterly terrified by this, and they are right to be. And from inside the house there is a voice singing, and the sound of a great loom, the shuttle going back and forth, and a woman weaving one of those immortal fabrics that only goddesses make, fine and gleaming and beautiful. She comes out at once. She invites them in. She is delighted to see them. She gives them cheese and barley and honey and wine, mixed together, which is a real Greek ritual drink called the kykeon, the same mixture used in the Eleusinian mysteries, and into it she puts a drug, and when they have drunk it, she strikes them with a wand, and they become pigs. Homer is very precise about the horror of it, and the precision is what makes it appalling. They have the heads of pigs, the voices of pigs, the bristles and the bodies of pigs, and the mind of a man, unchanged. She pens them and throws them acorns. Eurylochus, who stayed outside because he suspected a trap, runs back to the ship unable to speak. What follows is the turning point of the poem, though it does not look like one. Odysseus goes alone up through the wood to fetch his men back, and on the path he meets a young man who is Hermes in disguise, and Hermes gives him a plant. Homer names it moly, black at the root, with a flower like milk, hard for mortal men to dig, but the gods can do anything. It is the only time in Greek epic that a magical herb is described botanically, and people have been trying to identify it ever since. The most persuasive modern suggestion, first made properly in the 1950s and taken seriously by pharmacologists since, is the snowdrop, Galanthus nivalis. It has a dark bulb and a white flower. It grows in Greece, and it contains galantamine, a compound that is a genuine antidote to the poisoning caused by plants like datura and henbane, which are anticholinergic deliriants that cause hallucinations, confusion, and a loss of the sense of self. Datura and henbane grow all over the Mediterranean. They are in the nightshade family. A person poisoned with them can be profoundly disoriented, suggestible, and amnesiac. Whether any of this lies behind the story is unprovable, but it is a striking coincidence that the poem's antidote to a mind-altering drug is, chemically, an antidote to mind-altering drugs. Circe herself deserves better than her reputation. She is the daughter of Helios, the sun, and a sea nymph. She is not a wicked witch in the fairy tale sense. In the older strata of Greek religion, she looks very much like a figure of ritual power, one of those independent female divinities who existed before the Olympian order tidied everything up. Her name means hawk, her brother is Aetes of Colchis, and her niece is Medea, which places her in a family of powerful, dangerous, deeply knowledgeable women. And this brings us to something genuinely important about the ancient world. Magic and medicine were the same profession. The Greek word pharmakon, from which we get pharmacy, meant simultaneously drug, remedy, poison, and spell. There was no meaningful line between them. The woman who knew which route would stop a hemorrhage also knew which one would stop a heart, and both kinds of knowledge lived in the same head and were passed to the same daughters. Herbal expertise was overwhelmingly female knowledge in the ancient Mediterranean, and it was respected and feared in roughly equal measure. Look at the archaeology, and you find women's ritual authority everywhere in the Bronze Age Aegean. The frescoes from Akrotiri on Thera show women gathering saffron crocus and presenting it to a seated goddess, an image of what looks unmistakably like an organized female priesthood. And saffron was a genuine medicine used for menstrual pain and inflammation. Minoan seals show women in ritual poses, presiding, receiving. The Linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos, which are administrative documents and therefore rather trustworthy on this, name priestesses holding land in their own right, which in that world means real economic power. So when Homer's audience heard about a woman alone in a house in a wood, with the animals tame around her, weaving at a great loom, and knowing which roots did what, they were not hearing pure fantasy. They were hearing an exaggeration of something they knew existed and half distrusted. The scene when Odysseus arrives is famous and strange. She drugs him, it fails. She strikes him with the wand and he does not change, and she cries out in astonishment, and he draws his sword as Hermes told him to, and she immediately, in the middle of her own terror, understands who he is. "You must be Odysseus," she says. "Hermes always told me he would come." And then she invites him to bed. It is worth being honest about the power dynamics of that scene, which are not comfortable to modern ears, and were probably not entirely comfortable then. Odysseus makes her swear a great oath first, that she will not harm him or unman him once he is defenseless. She swears it, he accepts, and then she turns his men back, and Homer says, they became men again, younger than before, taller and handsomer, and that they all wept, and that the house rang with the sound of it, and even Circe was moved. And here is the part everyone forgets. They stay for a year, an entire year, feasting on meat and sweet wine in a house in the woods on an island nobody can find, and the poem passes over it in a handful of lines. It is Odysseus's own men who finally come to him and say, in effect, "Remember Ithaca." He had forgotten. Not through magic, just through comfort. That is the lotus again, in a more sophisticated form, and this time he ate it. When he finally asks Circe to send them home, she agrees at once, without argument. She has never been the obstacle. But she tells him there is one journey he must make first. He has to go to the land of the dead. He sits down and weeps and says he does not want to. He says his heart had no more desire to live and see the sunlight. And she, quite gently, tells him how it is done. "Let us stay in that house one more moment before we go down. The fire is low, the wine is warm. Outside in the dark, the wolves and the mountain lions move quietly between the trees, harming nobody, and the sea is somewhere beyond the wood, patient, waiting to be crossed. Tomorrow, they sail north to the edge of the world. They sail all day with a following wind that Circe sends, and at sunset, they come to the edge of the world." Homer calls it the deep flowing ocean, which in the Greek imagination was not a sea but a river, an enormous circular river running round the rim of the flat earth, and beyond it, the land of the Cimmerians, wrapped in cloud and mist, where the sun never shines, not when it climbs the sky, and not when it comes down again. Deadly night is stretched over those people, always. They beach the ship there, and they walk inland to a place where two rivers meet and pour into a third, and there, under a rock, Odysseus digs a pit. What he does next is a ritual, and it is described with the exactness of a liturgy, which tells you that Homer's audience recognized it. He pours 3 libations into the pit, first honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then water. He scatters white barley over it. He prays to the dead, and then he cuts the throats of a black ram and a black ewe over the pit, and lets the blood run down into the earth. And out of the dark they come, brides, unmarried young men, old men who have suffered much, girls with new grief in their hearts, men killed in battle, still in their bloodied armor. They come crowding round the pit with a strange, thin crying, and Homer says the pale fear took hold of Odysseus. He has to hold them off with his sword, because none of them may drink until he has spoken to the one he came for. This is not the Christian afterlife, and it is important not to let later imagery color it. There is no hell here, no punishment for ordinary people, and almost no reward. There is simply a gray place under the earth where everyone goes, king and beggar alike, and where what remains of you is a psyche, a breath, a shade, capable of speech only when given blood, and otherwise drifting. The Greeks found it profoundly bleak, and they said so. The moment that proves it is one of the greatest in ancient literature. Achilles comes to the pit. Achilles, who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one, who died young at Troy and won undying fame exactly as he wanted. And Odysseus, trying to be kind, tells him that he must be honored here as he was above, that he rules among the dead, that he should not grieve. And Achilles says no, do not console me about death. He says he would rather be alive, working the fields as a hired man for a landless farmer with nothing to his name, than be king over all the perished dead. That single speech overturns the entire value system of the Iliad. The greatest warrior in Greek legend, asked whether it was worth it, says it was not. Odysseus is listening to this very carefully. He has been offered immortality already, and he will be offered it again, and this conversation is one of the reasons he says no. Before Achilles there is Elpenor, the youngest of the crew, who fell off Circe's roof drunk on the last night and broke his neck, and whose body they left unburied because nobody noticed he was gone. He begs for a proper burial and a mound and his oar planted on top of it. That request, the oar on the grave, is such a real detail. Sailors' graves along the Mediterranean coast were marked exactly that way, and before all of them, there is his mother, Anticlea, alive when he sailed for Troy. Odysseus sees her at the edge of the crowd, and Homer says that when he saw her he wept, and yet he would not let her come near the blood, not before the prophet, because that was the instruction. He does his duty first. That is who he is. But sit with the image, because it is one of the most human things in the poem. He is standing with a drawn sword keeping his own mother back from the pit, while he waits for a prophet to finish. When he finally lets her drink, she tells him things he did not want to know, that his father Laertes sleeps in the ashes by the fire in winter, and outside in the leaves in summer, grieving, that his wife still waits, weeping, and that she herself died of nothing but missing him. And then he tries to embrace her, 3 times, and 3 times she goes through his arms like a shadow, like a dream. He asks her, almost angrily, why? And she explains that this is simply what the dead are. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and the bones together. Fire consumes all of that, and the psyche flies away and flutters like a dream. That is the Greek understanding of death, expressed with a plainness that has not been improved upon in 3,000 years. The prophet he came for is Tiresias of Thebes, blind in life and clear-sighted in death, and what he gives Odysseus is essentially a warning and a set of conditions. You may still get home. Poseidon is angry because of his son. When you come to the island of the sun and find the cattle grazing there, leave them alone, touch them, and you lose your ship and all your men, and even if you survive, you will come home late, in a bad way, in a foreign ship, to find trouble in your house. He also tells him something stranger which is easy to skip over, that after he has dealt with the trouble at home, he must take an oar and walk inland, away from the sea, until he comes to a people who know nothing of the sea, who put no salt on their food, who have never seen a ship, and he will know he has arrived when a stranger tells him that he is carrying a winnowing fan on his shoulder. There he must plant the oar and make sacrifice to Poseidon and go home, and death will come to him from the sea, gently, in a rich old age, with his people prosperous around him. An oar carried so far inland that nobody recognizes what it is. It is one of the most haunting images in the poem, and it is a promise of peace, eventually, in a place where the sea has no meaning. Where is this land of the dead? Ancient tradition mostly placed the entrance in the far west, and later Greeks and Romans pointed at Lake Avernus, near Cumae in Italy, a volcanic crater lake in a landscape of sulfurous vents, where birds were said to avoid flying over the water. There is a genuine ancient tunnel complex there. The Necromanteon at Ephyra in northwestern Greece, near where the rivers Acheron and Cocytus really do meet, was excavated in the 1960s and identified by its excavator as an oracle of the dead, though other archaeologists have argued it is simply a fortified farmhouse. As so often, the physical evidence is real, and its meaning is contested. But the geography of this place hardly matters. Everybody goes there. It is always to the north and always in the dark, and it is always, in every telling, the place where you finally hear the truth. They row back out along the river of ocean, and the sun comes up over them, and it is very hard to describe what sunlight feels like after that. Circe is waiting when they get back, and she gives them supper, and she stays up all night alone with Odysseus, telling him precisely what is coming. She is the best navigator in the poem. She does not deal in riddles. She gives him a route briefing, and it is the sort of briefing an experienced sailor gives a less experienced one before a bad passage. First, she says, "You will come to the Sirens. The Sirens are not what 1,000 years of art have made them. There are no scales here and no fishtails." That is a much later confusion, partly through the Latin word sirena being applied to mermaids in medieval bestiaries. In Greek art, the sirens are birds with women's heads, and they are frequently found in funerary contexts, carved on tombs, standing on graves, singing for the dead. There is a strong argument that they began as death spirits, soul birds, and only later became sea hazards. There are 2 of them in Homer. Later writers gave them 3, and names and instruments. What is fascinating, and what almost nobody remembers, is what they actually sing. They do not sing about sex. They do not sing about pleasure. What they offer, in Homer's Greek, is knowledge. They call Odysseus by name. They say, "Come here, glorious Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans." They say that nobody has ever rowed past this island without hearing their voice, and that everyone who does hear it goes away delighted and knowing more. And then they say the thing that gets him. "We know everything that happened at Troy. We know everything that happens anywhere on the fertile earth." They are offering him omniscience. They are offering the past explained and the present laid out flat. And for a man who has just come back from the dead, and who is famous above all else for wanting to know things, that is the most precise possible temptation. Homer notes, quietly, that around the island there is a meadow, and in the meadow, a great heap of men rotting, the skin shriveling on the bones. They died listening. Odysseus does a very strange thing, and it is worth thinking about. He could simply plug his own ears with the beeswax, as he does for his crew. Instead, he has himself tied to the mast, upright, with the ropes made fast, and he orders that if he begs to be released, they must bind him tighter. He wants to hear it. He wants the experience without the consequence, which is not a thing human beings are normally permitted, and he is the only man in all of Greek myth who gets away with it. And he does beg. Homer says his heart wanted to listen, and he signaled with his brows for the men to free him, and they rowed harder, and 2 of them got up and tied him tighter. The sea was flat calm. The sirens raised their voices in a still, windless air, which is the horrible perfection of it. There is no wind to help you flee. You have to row past. You have to work your way out of it by hand. What was really there? The practical answers are unromantic, and probably partly true. There are places along the Italian coast, the Ligali islets off Positano among them. traditionally identified as the Sirens' home, where the wind through rock formations and sea caves makes sounds that sailors have always found unnerving. Becalmed water near dangerous shoals is a genuine and well-documented killer. Sailors suffering exhaustion and dehydration hear things, and always have. But the meaning of the episode is completely clear regardless, and Homer wanted it clear, because he put a field of bones in the meadow so that nobody could pretend otherwise. The Sirens do not lie. That is what makes them terrible. Everything they promise, they can deliver. They really do know what happened at Troy. The men in that meadow got exactly what they were offered, and they starved to death in a flowering field, with all their questions answered. Odysseus survives it by arranging, in advance while he was still sane, to be unable to act on what he would want later. He does not trust his future self at all. He builds the restraint before the temptation arrives. Behavioral economists have a name for that now. They call it a Ulysses contract, and it is a phrase used in medicine, in addiction recovery, and in law. 3,000 years on, this is still the name for the wisest thing anyone has thought of doing about their own weakness. Feel the ropes ease as the island falls behind. The beeswax comes out of the men's ears. The sound of the sea returns, ordinary and enormous, and someone unties him, and he does not say anything for a while. Because ahead now, Circe told him, the passage narrows. Here is the only choice in the entire poem that cannot be outthought. Circe laid it out for him honestly, and she is the only one who does. There are two routes. She describes them both, and then she tells him which to take and why. And the reasoning is the coldest arithmetic in Homer. On one side there is a smooth rock, sheer, running up into cloud that never clears from its summit, summer or winter. Halfway up that cliff, out of reach of the strongest archer, there is a cave, and in the cave lives Scylla, with 12 dangling feet and 6 long necks and a head on each, and 3 rows of teeth in each head. She fishes. She hangs out of her cave and takes dolphins and seals, and, when a ship goes by, men. 1 from each head. 6 men, every time, no exceptions, and no ship has ever gone past her without paying. On the other side, a bowshot away, there is a lower rock with a wild fig tree on it, and beneath that rock is Charybdis, who 3 times a day sucks the black water down, and 3 times spews it out again. If you are there when she swallows, nothing can save you. Row past Scylla, Circe says. Better to lose 6 men than the whole ship. And then she tells him not to fight. She says specifically that if he stops to arm himself, Scylla will simply come out again and take 6 more. Row past, and mourn, and do not try to be a hero. He does not tell his crew. That is the thing that sits worst, and Homer knows it, because Odysseus himself admits it as he tells the story. He says he did not mention Scylla, because if he had, they would have stopped rowing and hidden in the hold, and then he arms himself anyway. 2 spears, on the foredeck, straining his eyes at the misty rock, disobeying the one clear instruction he had been given, because he cannot bear to do nothing. While he is watching for her, they are all watching Charybdis on the other side, appalled, and that is when the heads come down. Homer's simile for it is the most unbearable in the poem, and it is not a grand one. He compares Scylla to a fisherman on a headland with a long rod, casting a baited hook, hauling a small fish up and flinging it gasping onto the rocks. That is what the men look like. Small fish. And he says that they screamed and called out his name, and that they reached out their hands to him as they went up, and that of everything he suffered searching out the passages of the sea, this was the most pitiful thing he ever saw. He never mentions their names. 6 of them, and he does not name one. Now here, at last, we come back onto the real map, because Scylla and Charybdis have an address. The Strait of Messina, between the toe of Italy and the northeastern corner of Sicily, is about 3 kilometers across at its narrowest. It has been identified with this passage since antiquity, and unlike most of the geography in the Odyssey, the identification is broadly accepted, because the phenomena are real. Two different bodies of water meet in that strait, the Tyrrhenian and the Ionian, and they have different tidal cycles, and different salinities, and different temperatures. The result is a strong tidal current that reverses roughly every 6 hours, running at up to 5 knots in the Narrows, and where that current crosses the underwater sill, it produces genuine standing whirlpools. They are called garofali, locally. There are also violent upwellings called tagli or bastardi, and localized turbulence that can throw a small vessel around badly. 5 knots does not sound frightening in a modern boat. Consider it in a rowed hull with 50 exhausted men, where a fast cruising speed is maybe 4 or 5 knots on a good day. A current like that is not an inconvenience. It is a wall. There is a town called Scylla on the Calabrian shore, on a rocky promontory, with a castle on it now, and directly across from it, the Sicilian coast at Ganziri and Torre Faro. Sailors going through in a Bronze Age ship would have to take one side or the other, and would have to time it, and would sometimes get it wrong. So the myth is doing what myths do best. It is encoding a genuine navigational hazard into a story that a sailor will remember in a panic, when the water starts to turn under him and the shore is coming up too fast. Hug the cliff. You will lose something. Do not go into the middle. The phrase has outlived the geography, of course. To be between Scylla and Charybdis is to be caught between two evils with no third option, and every language in Europe has some version of it. The Romans had a proverb about running into Scylla while trying to avoid Charybdis. We say between a rock and a hard place, which is the same thing with the poetry removed. But there is something in the original that the proverb loses. The choice is not between two equal disasters. The Circe tells him plainly which is better. The horror is not the ambiguity. The horror is knowing exactly what it will cost, choosing it deliberately, and then having to stand on the deck and watch it happen to men who trusted you. That is command. That is the real weight of the thing, and it is the reason this passage is taught in military academies and business schools and hospitals, in places where somebody has to decide who does not get the resource. They come out into open water south of the strait, with 30-odd men left, and a captain who has not spoken since. And then, ahead, they hear cattle. Both prophecies have named this island. Tiresias in the underworld and Circe on Aea, independently, said the same thing. Thrinacia, where the cattle of Helios graze. Do not touch them. Odysseus, for once, does everything right. He tells his crew about the warning. He tells them the whole of it. He asks them to row straight past without landing. And Eurylochus, who has been getting steadily more insubordinate since Circe, says no. The argument he makes is entirely reasonable, and that is the trouble. He says the men are exhausted. He says night is coming, and that ships are wrecked at night by sudden squalls out of the dark. He says, give us one night ashore, we will cook a meal and sleep, and we will go on in the morning. Every man agrees with him. Odysseus is outvoted, and Homer says that at that moment he knew a god was contriving harm. So he makes them swear. Every man swears a mighty oath that if they find cattle or sheep on this island, nobody will kill a single one. They eat the provisions Circe gave them, and they sleep on the beach. And then the south wind comes, and blows, and does not stop. A month. Homer says 30 days of contrary winds. They cannot leave. They are trapped on an island with the food running out, watching cattle graze. And here is where the poem becomes genuinely fair to them, which is what makes the ending so painful. When the ship's provisions are gone, they do not immediately butcher the herd. They wander the island fishing with bent hooks and catching birds, anything they can get, and Homer says hunger gnawed at their bellies. They try. They hold out for weeks. Odysseus goes inland to pray, alone, and falls asleep. Everything terrible in this poem happens while he is asleep, and Eurylochus makes his last speech, and it is a good one, and it deserves quoting closely. He says that all deaths are hateful, but the most pitiful is to die of hunger. He says, "Let us drive off the best of the cattle and sacrifice to the gods properly. And if we get home to Ithaca, we will build Helios a rich temple." And he says that if the god wants to wreck the ship for it, and the other gods agree, he would rather die at sea in one gulp than waste away slowly on a desert island. That is not greed. That is a starving man making a reasonable choice. And they do it properly. They perform the ritual correctly, or as correctly as they can. They have no barley for the sacrifice, so they scatter oak leaves instead. They have no wine for the libation, so they use water. They burn the thigh bones wrapped in fat, exactly as the rite requires. They are trying, in impossible circumstances, to do the right thing. It does not help at all, because these are not ordinary cattle. They are the sun's own herd, 7 herds of 50, 350 in each of 2 categories. Numbers that scholars have long noticed correspond suspiciously well to the days of a lunar year. They do not breed and they do not die. They are, quite possibly, the days themselves. And then the strangest and most frightening thing in the entire poem happens. The hides begin to crawl along the ground. The meat, both roasted and raw, begins to bellow on the spits. There is no explanation. There is no god present. There is simply the sound of cattle coming out of the cooking meat for 6 days while the men eat it anyway, because they are starving. Odysseus wakes to the smell. Helios goes to Zeus and threatens to take the sun down into the house of the dead and shine among the dead instead, which is one of the most alarming threats in Greek literature. Zeus tells him to keep shining and promises to deal with it. On the 7th day, the wind drops and they sail. The moment the island is out of sight, a black cloud comes over the ship, and the sea goes dark beneath it, and the west wind arrives screaming. The mast snaps and falls, killing the helmsman. Lightning strikes the ship. Homer says the men were thrown into the water and carried on the waves like sea crows around the black hull, and the god took away their homecoming. Every one of them, all at once. Odysseus lashes the mast and the keel together with a leather backstay and rides the wreckage, alone, and the wind changes and carries him back north all night, and at dawn he sees the 2 rocks again, and he is going straight into Charybdis. What he does next is faintly ridiculous and completely brilliant. As the whirlpool swallows his raft, he leaps and catches the branches of that wild fig tree overhanging the water, and he hangs there like a bat, gripping, unable to get up and unable to let go, waiting for hours until Charybdis spits the timbers back up, and then he drops on top of them and paddles away with his hands. The greatest hero of the return voyage, hanging from a fig tree with his feet dangling over a whirlpool, waiting for his boat to be vomited back at him. 9 days he floats. On the 10th night, the gods bring him to an island. Everything he began with is now gone. 12 ships, 600 men, the plunder of Troy, all of it at the bottom of the sea. He arrives with nothing at all, not even clothes. And the woman who finds him on the beach is going to offer him the one thing he has never been offered before. Let the sound of the water go soft now. He is lying face down on warm sand, with his eyes closed, and the worst of it is genuinely over, though he does not know that yet. He is going to sleep for a long time. Here is a fact about the Odyssey that surprises almost everyone. All of that, the Cyclopes, Circe, the Sirens, the underworld, the whirlpool, all of it happens in about 2.5 years. The war took 10 years. The wandering took 10 years. Which means Odysseus spends 7 of those 10 years in exactly one place, on one island, with one woman, doing very little. Her name is Calypso. It means the concealer, from the Greek verb to hide, and she is very well named, because what she does to him is hide him from the world. The island is called Ogygia, and it is described as the navel of the sea, meaning the absolute middle of nowhere. Homer's description of it is one of the loveliest pieces of landscape writing in ancient literature, and it is worth walking through slowly, because this is where he stays. There is a great cave, and a fire of split cedar and juniper burning on the hearth, so that the scent of it carries right across the island. She is inside, singing in a beautiful voice, weaving at her loom with a golden shuttle. Around the cave there is a wood of alder and poplar and sweet-smelling cypress, and long-winged birds nest there, owls and hawks and sea crows. A vine grows over the mouth of the cave, heavy with grapes. 4 separate springs run clear water in different directions. There are meadows of violet and wild parsley. Homer says that even a god who came there would stand and look at it in wonder and be glad. And in the middle of all of that, Odysseus sits on the shore. The image is one of the most desolate in the poem, and it hardly seems to belong in it. Homer says he sat on the rocks and the beaches, breaking his heart with tears and groaning and sorrow, and looked out over the barren sea, weeping. He has paradise behind him, and he sits with his back to it. She loves him. There is no reason to doubt that, and no indication that she is cruel. She weaves and sings and keeps him, and, in the plainest reading, and she does not let him leave, because there is no ship and no way to build one, and no way off the island unless she permits it. He sleeps beside her at night. Homer says, in the hollow cave, unwilling beside the willing. That is a hard line, and it should be a hard line. Modern readers notice it and are right to. And then she offers him the thing. Hermes arrives with an order from Zeus that Odysseus must be released, and Calypso is furious, and her fury is one of the sharpest speeches in Greek literature. She points out, correctly, that the gods are jealous and cannot bear goddesses sleeping with mortal men, and she lists the ones who were punished for it. She points out that she saved his life when he came drifting on a keel with everyone else dead. Then she goes to him and tells him he can go. But first she asks him. She says, "If you knew how much suffering is still ahead of you, you would stay here with me and be immortal, however much you long for your wife." And then she says the thing that no woman should ever have to say. She asks whether she is not as good-looking as Penelope. She says it would hardly be right for a mortal woman to compete with a goddess in figure or in beauty. And Odysseus, who is a diplomat before he is anything else, answers with enormous care. He agrees with her. He says outright that Penelope is beneath her in looks and stature, that his wife is mortal and Calypso is deathless and ageless. And then he says he wants to go home anyway. Every day, he says, "All my days I long for it, and to see the day of my homecoming." Stop there. That is the center of the whole poem. He is not choosing the better option, he says so. He concedes the entire argument on aesthetics and on logic, and on the terms of the offer, and then he says no, because he wants his own house, and his own wife, and his own rocky little island where the goats are. He is turning down immortality. We should be clear about how enormous that is in a Greek context. This is a culture without a happy afterlife. He has been down there. He has seen it, with his own eyes, and heard Achilles say that being a landless laborer alive is better than being king of the dead. He knows exactly what he is choosing. He is choosing to die, one day, in exchange for a few decades in the right place with the right people. And what he is really choosing, underneath that, is time itself. Because immortality with Calypso means an endless, unchanging present. Nothing on Ogygia moves. The vine is always in fruit. The springs always run. The fire always burns. She never ages, and neither would he. It is beautiful, and it is completely static, which is another way of saying it is dead. To go home is to accept that Telemachus is 20 and not a baby, that his father is old, that his wife's face has changed, that the dog he raised as a puppy is now very old indeed. It is to accept loss as the price of things having happened at all. That is not a small idea, and it is 3,000 years old, and it has never been improved upon. She helps him build the raft. That is a wonderful, undersold detail. Once she has accepted it, she is completely generous. She brings him the tools, a great bronze axe fitted to his palm, and a well-polished adze, and she shows him where the tall trees stand, seasoned and dry and good for floating. He builds it himself over 4 days, broad in the beam, decked, with a mast and a steering oar and wattle screens against the waves, and she brings him cloth for a sail, and provisions, wine and water, and a leather sack of food, and she sends a warm following breeze. He sails on the 5th day, and steers by the bear on his left hand, and for 17 days he does not sleep. Ogygia has been placed by various ancient and modern writers at Gozo, in the Maltese archipelago, where there is a cave still called Calypso's, and at Perigil off Morocco, and in the Ionian, and by ancient geographers in the Atlantic, somewhere beyond the Pillars of Heracles. None of it is provable. The truthful answer is that Ogygia is deliberately not on any map, because it is the place outside the world where nothing happens and nobody can find you. Then, on the 18th day, with land at last showing on the horizon, Poseidon comes back from Ethiopia, sees him, and says out loud, more or less, "You have got to be joking." The storm that follows destroys the raft. A sea nymph called Ino gives him a veil to keep him afloat, and he does not trust her, because of course he does not. He is Odysseus, and he clings to the wreckage until it is smashed into single planks, and only then does he take the veil. 2 days and 2 nights in the water, and on the 3rd morning a coast and a river mouth, and he prays to the river, and the river holds back its current and lets him in. He crawls out naked, swollen with salt, unable to speak, and he crawls into a thicket of 2 olive trees, one wild and one cultivated, growing so closely together that neither wind nor rain nor sun could get through, and he scrapes together a pile of dead leaves. Homer compares him to a man on a lonely farm burying a glowing brand in the ashes to keep the seed of fire alive overnight. That is what is left of him, a single ember, buried in leaves, on an unknown shore, and then Athena pours sleep over his eyes. He is woken by girls shouting. This is my favorite chapter of the Odyssey, and I suspect it is many people's, because after everything, after the giants and the whirlpool and the dead, what saves him is a teenage princess doing the laundry. Her name is Nausicaa, and she is the daughter of King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, and she has come down to the river mouth with the household girls and a mule cart full of washing, because Athena put the idea in her head in a dream. They tread the clothes clean in the washing pits, spread them along the shingle to dry, bathe, eat, oil themselves, and then play a ball game on the shore while they wait. Somebody misses a catch, the ball goes into the river, they all scream, and a naked, filthy, salt-crusted, terrifying man comes out of the bushes holding a branch in front of himself. Everybody runs except her. Athena gives her courage, Homer says, but I have always thought the poem gives her rather more credit than that. She stands still. And Odysseus, who has one chance to get this right, makes the finest speech of his life. He does not touch her knees in supplication as custom would allow, because he calculates instantly that grabbing a young woman's knees while naked would be catastrophic. He stands at a distance and speaks instead. He asks whether she is a goddess or a mortal. He says that if she is mortal, blessed are her father and mother, and blessed her brothers, and blessed above all is the man who will one day take her home as his bride. He compares her to a young palm tree he once saw growing beside the altar of Apollo on Delos, which he had stopped and stared at because nothing so slender had ever come out of the ground. Then he asks for a rag to cover himself and directions to the town, and she answers him with complete composure, this girl of perhaps 15, and she says something remarkable. She tells him that Zeus gives out fortune to good and bad alike, that he must simply endure what he has been given, and then she calls the girls back and tells them off for running, and orders food and oil brought and clothes. She also thinks about the gossip. She tells him not to walk into town beside her cart, because people talk, and she can hear exactly what they would say. Who is that tall, handsome stranger with Nausicaa? Some sailor she has picked up, and she too good for all the Phaeacian men who want her. Walk behind, she says. Go to the grove of Athena outside the walls, wait. Then come to the palace by yourself and go straight past my father and take hold of my mother's knees. She is 15, and she is managing her own reputation, her father's court, and a shipwrecked stranger, all in one speech. Nothing romantic happens. It is very lightly implied that she would like it to. And later, when he is leaving, she stands by a pillar and says only, "Farewell, stranger, and remember me when you are home, because you owe me your life." And he answers that he will pray to her as a god for all his days, because she gave him back his life. That is all. And it is one of the most quietly moving exchanges in the poem, because both of them know exactly what is not going to happen. The Phaeacians themselves are fascinating and slightly unreal. They live at Scheria. They are unmatched sailors, and their ships are magical. Homer says they need no steersman and no rudders, that they know the thoughts and the minds of men, and that they know every city and every rich field on earth, and that they cross the sea wrapped in mist and cloud, and that they never fear damage or loss. That is a fantasy of seafaring. It is what every sailor in a leaky road hull wishes were true. Their court is a portrait of the ideal civilization, and it is worth noticing what an ideal civilization looks like to a Greek of the 8th century. The palace has bronze walls and a frieze of blue enamel and gold doors with silver posts, and gold and silver dogs made by Hephaestus standing on either side, and inside there are 50 serving women grinding grain and weaving, and outside a great orchard where pear grows on pear and fig on fig and apple on apple, and the fruit never fails, in winter or in summer, because a west wind is always blowing, and one crop ripens as the next appears. And they hold assemblies, and they welcome strangers, because that is the point of them. The Phaeacians are the exact opposite of the Cyclopes. They are the polar answer to that first island. Ships, laws, agriculture, craft, athletic games, poetry, and above all, xenia, the sacred welcome of the guest. The queen, Arete, is the one he must supplicate, and this is unusual enough that Homer comments on it. Her husband honors her as no other woman on earth is honored, and people come to her to settle their quarrels, and her judgment is accepted. In a poem full of powerful women, it is easy to miss how consistently this culture placed real authority in the hall. He sits in the ashes of their hearth until she speaks, and they take him in, and feed him, and hold games in his honor, and one of the young men insults him by suggesting he looks more like a merchant than an athlete, and Odysseus, delighted, gets up and throws a discus further than any of them without taking his cloak off. And then, at the feast, the blind singer Demodocus takes up his lyre and sings about Troy. He sings about a quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, and later, at Odysseus's own request, he sings about the wooden horse. And the man at the table pulls his great purple cloak over his head and weeps, and only the king notices, and Homer gives him a simile so devastating that scholars have written entire books about it. He says Odysseus wept like a woman who throws herself on the body of her husband, fallen in front of his own city, defending his town and his children, and who is beaten across the back and shoulders by spear butts and led away into slavery. He weeps like the women he made. Nobody in the ancient world had ever written anything like that, and I am not sure anybody has since. Alcinous stops the music and asks him, gently, who he is, and why the fall of Troy makes him cry. And Odysseus puts down the cup and says, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, and my fame goes up to heaven. And then he tells them everything, and the whole middle of the poem, all the monsters and the islands, is a story told by a man at a dinner table to people who have been kind to him, which is worth remembering. Every single one of those adventures is his own account. There is no other witness. All the other witnesses are dead. They give him gifts, treasure heaped up to replace everything he lost, and they put him aboard one of their impossible ships at nightfall, and he lies down on the deck, and a sweet sleep comes over him, and Homer says it was most like death. The ship runs all night, faster than a hawk, and the ploughing of it never wakes him. And at dawn they carry him ashore, still sleeping, and set him down on a beach with all his treasure stacked beside him under an olive tree, and they sail away. He is home. He does not know it yet. He is still asleep. While all of this has been happening, on the other side of the world, a young man has been going quietly mad in his own house. The Odyssey does not actually begin with Odysseus. That surprises people. It begins with his son, and the first 4 books of the poem, which scholars call the Telemachy, do not feature the hero at all, except as an absence that everyone talks about. It is a remarkably confident piece of construction. Before we are allowed to meet the man, we are made to feel the size of the hole he left. Telemachus is around 20. He has never seen his father's face. He says at one point, with a bleakness that stops you, that he only knows what he has been told, that no man ever really knows who his own father is. He is in an impossible position, and he knows it. He is not a child anymore, so he cannot be excused. He is not established, so he cannot command. There are 108 armed men in his hall, eating his inheritance and laughing at him, and there is nothing he can do about it. And every day he has to sit down and eat dinner with them. Athena arrives disguised as an old family friend, and gives him the advice that starts everything. Call an assembly, tell them to leave, then take a ship and go and find out what happened to your father, because a rumor is better than nothing, and if you learn he is dead, you can bury him properly and let your mother remarry with honor. And then she says something else, which is really the engine of the whole subplot. She tells him he is not a child now, and that it is time to stop behaving like one. And she points out that another young man, Orestes, won fame across the world for avenging his murdered father. Orestes hangs over this entire poem like a shadow. Agamemnon came home from Troy and was murdered in his own house by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, and his son Orestes came back years later and killed them both. That story is mentioned again and again in the Odyssey, by gods, by ghosts, by kings, and it functions as the alternative ending. It is the version where the wife betrays you and the homecoming is a slaughter in a bathtub. Every time Homer mentions it, he is quietly reminding you what Penelope could have been, and is not. So Telemachus calls his assembly, and it fails, and he goes anyway, secretly. He takes a ship at night without telling his mother, because if he told her she would stop him, and he sails for Pylos. Now this is the loveliest thing about the Telemachy, and it is why I did not want to leave it out of tonight. The boy's journey is a tour of the successful homecomings. At Pylos he meets Nestor, ancient, garrulous, endlessly reminiscent, who fought at Troy and came home safely and easily, and now presides over a large, happy family on a beach where they are sacrificing bulls to Poseidon when the ship arrives. Nestor talks. He talks a great deal. He talks about the old days and about how much better everyone used to be, and he cannot tell Telemachus anything useful about his father, but he treats him beautifully, and he bathes him and feeds him and lends him a chariot and his own son as a companion. Pylos, by the way, is real, and we have dug it up. The palace of Nestor at Anno Englianos in Messenia was excavated from 1939 by Carl Blegen, and it is the best preserved Mycenaean palace we have, with its megaron and its enormous hearth, a bathroom with a fitted terracotta tub still in place, and the archive of Linear B tablets that transformed our understanding of the age. And in 2015, a few hundred meters away, archaeologists from the University of Cincinnati opened an undisturbed shaft grave containing a warrior burial of around 1500 before the Common Era, with more than 3,000 objects in it: gold rings, a meter-long bronze sword, ivory, and an agate sealstone barely more than 3 centimeters across, carved with a combat scene so fine that some of the detail cannot be seen without magnification. Nobody knows how they carved it. There were no lenses. That object, the Pylos combat agate, is one of the most extraordinary things ever recovered from the Aegean Bronze Age. Then Telemachus goes overland by chariot to Sparta, and this is where it gets strange, because in Sparta he meets Menelaus and Helen. Helen, the woman the war was fought over. She is back home, married to her first husband, running a household, and it is all completely unbearably normal. She comes down into the hall while the guests are being received, and she recognizes Telemachus instantly from his resemblance to his father. And then, when the conversation turns to Troy and everyone starts crying, she drugs the wine. That is the Nepenthe passage. She puts a drug into the mixing bowl that takes away grief and anger, and makes a man unable to weep even if his mother and father died in front of him. And Homer says she got it in Egypt. And then, with everyone pleasantly anesthetized, they sit around swapping stories about the war. And the stories they tell are about each other, and they do not match. Helen tells one in which she recognized Odysseus when he came into Troy disguised as a beggar, and helped him, and was already longing to go home. Menelaus tells one, immediately afterwards, about the wooden horse, in which Helen walked around it in the dark, calling out to the men inside, in the voices of their own wives, trying to make them answer and give themselves away. He is sitting next to her. She has just drugged everyone, and he tells that story to her son's friend at dinner. You are left with two irreconcilable versions of the same woman, across about 200 lines, in the same room, from the two people best placed to know. Homer offers no verdict. Menelaus does eventually give Telemachus what he came for. He tells his own homecoming story, which is spectacular in its own right, and involves being trapped by calm weather on an island off Egypt for 20 days, and being told by a sea nymph to ambush her own father, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, Proteus, by hiding under sealskins on the beach, and holding on to him while he turns into a lion and a snake, and water, and a tree, until he gives up and answers questions. And Proteus tells him that Odysseus is alive, on an island, weeping, held by a nymph, with no ship and no crew, and no way to leave. So the news reaches Sparta, while the man himself is still sitting on Calypso's shore, and Telemachus turns round and sails home, dodging an ambush that the suitors have laid for him in a narrow strait, and lands on a beach on the far side of the island, and walks up to a pig farm in the hills, where a beggar is sitting by the fire. That is why the reunion in that hut lands as hard as it does. He has just spent a month in the houses of men who came home. He has seen what a whole family looks like, and a father who is present, and an old man's hall full of sons. And he has come back to a house with a hole in it, to find the hole sitting by the fire in rags, waiting for him. He wakes on his own beach and does not recognize it. Athena has poured a mist over everything, and so the paths look wrong, and the harbor looks wrong, and the long-leaved trees and the rocks, and the flowing streams are all unfamiliar. And Odysseus stands up among his own stacked treasure, and groans and slaps his thighs, and says that he has been dumped in another foreign country by liars. He counts the tripods and the cauldrons first, to make sure the Phaeacians have not robbed him, even here, even now. And then a young shepherd appears, and he asks where he is, and the shepherd tells him the name of the island, and Homer says that Odysseus was glad in his heart, glad in his own country. And then, immediately, without pausing, he lies about who he is. He invents a Cretan, he gives him a father, and a killing, and a flight overseas, and a shipwreck, an entire biography, fluently, on the spot, on the beach of his own kingdom, in the first 30 seconds of coming home. And the shepherd, who is Athena, laughs out loud and touches his cheek and turns into a tall, beautiful woman and tells him he is incorrigible. She says that even here, in his own land, he will not stop with his tricks and his lying stories, that he loves them from the bottom of his heart. And she says the thing that explains the entire friendship: "You are the best of mortals for counsel and words, and I among all gods am famous for wit and craft, and you did not know Athena, She is not offended. She is charmed. It is the warmest scene between a god and a human being anywhere in Greek myth. Two professional deceivers appreciating one another's work. Then she tells him what is waiting for him, and the second half of the poem begins. Because here is the thing, getting home is the halfway point. There have been men in his house for years, more than 100 of them, young nobles from Ithaca and from Dulichium and Same and Zakynthus, sitting in his hall, eating his herds, drinking his wine, courting his wife, and waiting for her to give in. They have consumed his estate for 3 years or more. They intend to kill his son, who has just sailed to the mainland to ask after him, and Penelope has been holding them off with the only tools she has. He cannot simply walk in and announce himself, one man against 108, so Athena disguises him, and the disguise is savage. She withers the fine skin on his supple limbs, destroys the fair hair on his head, wrinkles him all over like an old man, dims his eyes, and dresses him in filthy rags and a torn deerskin with a beggar's stick and a battered bag on a rope. And the man who blinded the Cyclopes walks up the hill to a pig farm. The pig farm is the great surprise of the Odyssey. Homer spends 4 entire books, hundreds of lines, in a swineherd's hut on a hillside, and they are among the loveliest in the poem. The swineherd is called Eumaeus, and he is a slave, and he is the most decent character in the entire epic. He is out repairing sandals when the beggar arrives, and his dogs go for the stranger, and he throws stones and calls them off, and says that the old man was nearly torn apart, and that would have been a disgrace on him. He takes him in. He kills 2 young pigs for him, apologizing that the suitors get the fat ones. He gives him the best place by the fire and spreads his own bedding, a goatskin, for the stranger to sit on. He shares his wine. He asks nothing, and when he talks about his absent master with a grief so plain that the master himself, sitting there in rags, has to keep his face still. Homer does something here that he does almost nowhere else. He addresses Eumaeus directly. He breaks off from the third person and says, "And then you answered him, Eumaeus, swineherd." He does it more than a dozen times. This small, intimate turn towards a slave in a hut, and nobody has ever fully explained why, and everybody feels it. Eumaeus was born a prince, it turns out, on an island called Syri, and was stolen as a small child by a Phoenician woman who worked in his father's house, sold to traders, and bought by Laertes. He has been on this hillside ever since. He raised Odysseus's sister. He remembers. The picture of Bronze Age and early Iron Age slavery in these books is unglamorous and precise. Slaves are property, bought and sold, taken in raids, and Homer states plainly through Eumaeus that Zeus takes away half a man's worth on the day that slavery comes upon him. That is not approval, it is observation, and it is bleak, and it sits in the middle of the poem without comment. Telemachus comes back from the mainland, having slipped past the ambush the suitors laid for him, and comes to the hut first, because Athena tells him to. And Eumaeus jumps up and drops what he is carrying, and runs to him and kisses his head and his eyes and his hands and weeps, like a father. Homer says, greeting a beloved only son come back after 10 years abroad. And then Eumaeus is sent down to the town with a message, and father and son are alone in a hut for the first time in 20 years. Athena takes the disguise off, and Telemachus is frightened, and says he must be a god, and Odysseus says no, and says the plainest thing he says in the whole poem, "I am your father, the one you have been grieving for," and they both break down. Homer says they wailed like birds, like sea eagles, or vultures whose young have been stolen from the nest before they could fly. The plan they make together is patient and cold. Nothing must be said, not to Penelope, not to the household. Odysseus will go into his own house as a beggar and take whatever comes. And what comes, first, is the dog, Argos. Odysseus raised him as a puppy and never lived to hunt with him because he sailed for Troy. He is now 20 years old. He is lying on a heap of dung outside the gate, in front of the doors, full of ticks, neglected by everyone since his master left. And he lifts his head, and he pricks his ears, and he knows him instantly. He is too weak to get up. He wags his tail, and drops his ears, and he cannot move. And Odysseus, who cannot acknowledge him, who cannot risk being recognized at the gate of his own house, turns his face away, and wipes away a tear where the swineherd will not see it, and makes small talk about the dog's breeding. Homer says that the fate of Black Death took Argos in that same hour, once he had seen Odysseus after 20 years. There is no other death in the poem given that weight. Not one of the 6 men taken by Scylla, not one of the crew. A dog on a dung heap outside a gate, who waited, and recognized him, and died. If you are still awake, that one is allowed to get you. It gets everybody. He walks through his own front door as a beggar, and this is our chance to look at the house. Homer's descriptions of the palace on Ithaca have been checked against archaeology for 150 years, and the results are genuinely interesting, because they do not match a single period. They are a composite, which is exactly what you would expect from a poem assembled over centuries. The layout he describes has a courtyard with a colonnade, an outer porch, and a great hall with a central hearth, and 4 wooden pillars around it, and a smoke hole above, benches and chairs along the walls, and an upper story with private rooms reached by stairs. There is a storeroom with a high threshold and a locked door, holding gold, bronze, chests of clothing, jars of old wine standing in rows against the wall, and vessels of olive oil. There is a threshing floor outside, and a dunghill, and a fountain house where women come for water. Now compare that with what has actually been dug up. The Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Mycenae and Sirens, excavated over the last century, all have a megaron, a rectangular hall with a great circular hearth in the middle, 4 columns around it supporting a raised roof with an opening for smoke, and a throne against one wall. At Pylos, the so-called Palace of Nestor, excavated by Carl Blegen from 1939, the hearth is 4 meters across, and the floor around it was painted, and there is a small drain and a channel that most scholars think was for libations poured beside the throne. That is Homer's hall. The correspondence is real, but Pylos also had something Homer's world does not, and its absence is the loudest silence in the poem. It had an archive. When Blegen dug the first trench at Pylos, he hit clay tablets almost immediately, hundreds of them, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the building. They are written in Linear B, deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris as an early form of Greek, and they are not poems, they are inventories, sheep counts, wheel repairs, bronze allocations to smiths, rations of figs and olives issued to named work groups of women and their children, perfumed oil production, lists of coastal watchers. The tablets from Pylos include a set that appear to record emergency arrangements, rowers assigned, bronze collected from sanctuaries, watchers posted along the shore, and then the writing stops, because the palace burned. That is a real Bronze Age kingdom. It is a bureaucracy. It is scribes and quotas and centrally managed storerooms, and a redistributive economy, with a king at the top who is called the Wanax. There is nothing remotely like that in Homer. Nobody writes anything down. Nobody counts anything for the state. There are no scribes, no tablets, no quotas. Wealth in the Odyssey is measured in visible things you can hold and give away. Tripods, cauldrons, cloaks, cups, and above all in cattle and sheep and pigs, which tells us that the world of these poems is not really the Bronze Age at all. It is a memory of the Bronze Age, filtered through the 400 years of illiteracy that followed the collapse, and painted in the colors of the early Iron Age society that was actually telling the story. Bronze weapons, because tradition demanded it, but funeral customs and social arrangements that look 8th century, boar's tusk helmets that had not been made in 400 years, described accurately, because a line of poetry preserved them like a fly in amber. That is one of the reasons this poem is such a peculiar treasure. It is a layered thing. You can see the strata in it, like the layers at Hisarlik. Now walk into the hall. Every evening the same thing happens. Sheep and goats and pigs are driven in and slaughtered in the yard. The meat is roasted on spits over the fire. Bread is brought in baskets by the serving women. Wine is mixed with water in a great bowl, because drinking it neat was considered barbaric, and poured into cups. A herald moves round. A singer, Phemius, sings whether he wants to or not. And 108 young men eat another day's worth of a missing man's estate. Odysseus sits on the threshold of his own house, with a bag on his shoulder, and begs from them, going along the row, taking what he is given, watching who gives and who does not. He is compiling a list. One of them, Antinous, throws a footstool and hits him on the right shoulder at the base of the back. And Homer says that Odysseus stood firm as a rock and did not stagger, and shook his head in silence, brooding on evil. Another beggar arrives, a big loud local man called Iris, who works as a messenger for the suitors and picks a fight for the entertainment of the hall. And Odysseus, who is faced with the problem of how to win without revealing what he actually is, hits him carefully, just once, under the ear, and breaks his jaw, and drags him out through the door, and props him against the wall of the courtyard, and puts his stick in his hand. The suitors laugh until they nearly die. The word for what they are doing has no good English equivalent. Hubris. It does not mean pride, whatever the popular usage. It means the deliberate humiliation of someone who cannot retaliate, done for pleasure. It was a criminal offense in classical Athens, and it is the specific crime this poem exists to punish. They are eating another man's food, in his house, and abusing a beggar under his roof, which is the one thing above all others that the gods were said to watch for. Because in Greek belief, Zeus himself went among men in disguise, and the poem says so directly through one of the suitors' own mouths. He is standing right there, in rags, watching all of it, and upstairs, a woman who has been alone for 20 years is about to come down and speak to a stranger. Let us be fair to them for a moment, because the poem is not, and a documentary should be. There are 108 of them, and Homer names them. They are not foreigners and they are not brigands. They are the sons of the leading families of Ithaca and the neighboring islands, which is to say they are the entire next generation of the local aristocracy. Some of them, on the day Odysseus sailed for Troy, were children. They have grown up in a kingdom with no king. That is the political situation, and it is worth taking seriously, because it explains everything. A man went away 20 years ago. Nobody knows if he is alive. His son was an infant and is now barely of age and has no following. His father has withdrawn to a farm and will not act. There is no mechanism, none at all, for what happens next, because kingship in this world is personal and not institutional. There is no constitution. There is no council with authority to declare a throne vacant, and so the question of who marries the queen becomes the question of who rules. Penelope is not being courted for her beauty, whatever the young men say. She is being courted because her hand is a throne. Whoever she chooses, or is forced to choose, becomes king of Ithaca and the surrounding islands, and every ambitious family in the archipelago has a candidate in that hall. That is why they will not go home. That is why none of them will withdraw. The moment you leave the hall, someone else wins. Their tactic is siege by consumption. They have moved in, and they are eating the estate down to nothing. And this is not merely rudeness, it is politics. Every ox they slaughter reduces the wealth of the house of Odysseus and weakens Telemachus's ability ever to resist them. They are dismantling a rival dynasty, one dinner at a time. Telemachus tries. In the very first book he calls an assembly, the first on Ithaca in 20 years, and he stands up and asks the men of the island to stop this, and it goes nowhere. The elders sympathize and do nothing. An old man interprets an omen of 2 eagles and is jeered at. Antinous blames Penelope, and the assembly breaks up. That is a devastating picture of a failed state, and it comes at the very start of the poem, long before any of the monsters. Ithaca has forgotten how to govern itself. The suitors also break the deepest rule in the culture, and they break it twice over. Hospitality in the Greek world flowed in both directions. A host must feed and protect a guest, but a guest must not exhaust a host. To consume without limit, to abuse the servants, to insult the beggar at the door, to plot murder against the son of the house while eating at his table. That is the total collapse of Xenia, and everyone listening to this poem knew what it meant. There are gradations among them, and Homer is careful about it. Antinous is the worst, aggressive and cruel, the one who throws the stool and organizes the ambush to kill Telemachus. Eurymachus is smoother, a talker, publicly reasonable, and privately the most dangerous. Amphinomus is decent, and Odysseus tries to warn him, tells him quietly to go home before the master returns, and Homer says that Athena had already bound him to his fate and he stayed. And Leodes the priest, who never approved and always disliked what the others did, dies anyway. That is worth noting, because this poem is not sentimental about justice. It is a poem in which the innocent get killed too, the most uncomfortable part of the whole ending, and it is right that it is uncomfortable. Concerns 12 of the household women. They had relationships with the suitors, and the poem treats this as treachery, and after the killing, they are made to carry out the bodies and clean the hall, and are then executed by hanging. Homer describes it with a terrible image. Birds caught in a net, their feet twitching a little, and not for long. Modern readers stop cold at that passage, and should. These are enslaved women, in a house occupied by armed men, and the question of consent as we would understand it does not seriously arise. The poem does not ask it. Emily Wilson's translation was widely discussed a few years ago, partly for refusing to call them sluts, as many earlier English versions did, and for using the neutral word for what they were, which is girls or slaves. So the Odyssey is not a moral instruction manual. It is a 3,000-year-old poem from a slave-holding warrior aristocracy, and it contains their assumptions along with their genius, and being honest about both is the only respectful way to read it. What the poem is quite clear about, though, is that the killing itself is justified within its own terms. This is not revenge in the modern sense. It is the restoration of order. The suitors were warned repeatedly, by omens, by prophets, by strangers, and every warning was laughed at. And there is one final grace note that people forget. After the slaughter, the families of the dead men come for Odysseus in arms, and there is nearly a civil war on the island, and it is only stopped by direct divine intervention, Athena and a thunderbolt from Zeus, imposing a forgetting and a peace. Even in the poem's own logic, violence does not settle it. Something else has to. And now the woman. I want to make a case here, and it is not a controversial one among scholars anymore, though it might be new to some listening. Penelope is not the passive figure that popular memory has made of her. The image of the patient wife weeping at her loom, waiting, enduring, is real, but it is about a third of the truth. She is the only person in this poem who outthinks Odysseus. Start with the shroud, because it is the most famous piece of intelligence work in ancient literature. Pressed to remarry, unable to refuse outright, she announces that she cannot possibly choose a husband until she has finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, because it would be a scandal in the eyes of the local women if the old man were to die without one. Nobody can argue with that. It is an unimpeachable piece of religious and social duty, and it is the one form of authority a woman in that world holds absolutely. Funeral textiles were the business of the women of the house. To object would be shameful, so she weaves the great web by day, and every night she brings torches into the room and unpicks it. 3 years, 3 full years of undoing her own work in the dark. and coming back down each morning to a piece of cloth that has not grown. It only ends because one of the household women informs on her, and they catch her at it. Now that is not passivity. That is a stalling operation conducted under permanent surveillance, in a house full of hostile men, with no allies and no army, and no legal standing, by a woman who had to appear to be cooperating the entire time, and it worked for 3 years. Then look at the bow, because the contest of the bow, the thing that triggers the entire ending of the poem, is her idea. She proposes it. She goes to the storeroom herself, and Homer follows her there, and describes her taking down the great bow of Odysseus from its peg, and sitting with it on her knees, and weeping over the case before carrying it into the hall. And she sets the terms. Whoever strings this bow and shoots an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads set in a line, him I will marry. Think about what she has actually designed there. She has invented a test that no ordinary man can pass, on equipment belonging to her missing husband, at exactly the moment when a mysterious beggar with a familiar bearing has arrived in the hall. Scholars have argued for a century about how much she knows. Some say she recognizes him and never says so, playing along in perfect silence, because to speak would kill them both. Others say she does not know, but senses, and acts on the sense. Others say the timing is pure coincidence engineered by Athena. Homer, characteristically, never tells us. The interior of Penelope's mind is the one place in the poem he does not go. But read the interview scene and judge for yourself. She has the beggar brought to her privately and questions him closely. He gives her the Cretan story, the same false biography, and she tests it. She asks him to describe the clothes Odysseus was wearing when he left, 20 years ago, and he describes the purple cloak with a golden brooch, showing a hound holding a struggling fawn in its forepaws, and the tunic that shone like the skin of a dried onion. And Homer says her knees went weak, and her heart melted, and she wept for her own husband, sitting there beside her. And then she tells him a dream about an eagle killing her geese, and asks him to interpret it. And then, extraordinarily, she says she does not trust dreams, and delivers the passage about the 2 gates, the gate of ivory, through which false dreams come to deceive us, and the gate of polished horn, through which the true ones pass. Then she announces the contest of the bow for tomorrow. Whatever is happening in that woman's head, it is not simple. And then there is the bed, which is the finest scene in the poem, and the reason I would argue she is its equal protagonist. The suitors are dead. The hall is cleaned. Telemachus has vouched for him. The nurse Eurycleia has already recognized him from the scar on his thigh. Everyone in the house knows, and Penelope comes downstairs and sits by the fire opposite him and says nothing at all. Her son gets angry with her, calls her hard-hearted, says no other woman would keep away from a husband home after 20 years, and she says, quite calmly, that if he really is Odysseus, then the 2 of them have signs between them that nobody else knows. Then she sets one final test, and she sets it in front of him, and she does it by giving an instruction to a servant. Bring the bed out of the bedroom, she says. Make it up for him out here. And Odysseus, the most self-controlled liar in Greek literature, the man who watched his own dog die without moving a muscle in his face, loses his temper instantly. He says, "Who has moved my bed? Who could have moved it?" And he tells her how he built it, because there was an olive tree growing in the courtyard, thick as a pillar, and he built the bedroom around it, and cut the trunk down from the root, and shaped it with bronze, and made it the bedpost, and inlaid it with gold and silver and ivory. And no man can move that bed unless he has cut through a living tree. That is the sign. Nobody knew it but the 2 of them and one servant. And Homer says her knees and her heart gave way, and she ran to him and threw her arms round his neck, and it was as welcome to her as the sight of land is to swimmers when Poseidon has smashed their ship at sea, and only a few of them struggle out through the surf and stand at last on the shore. He gives her the shipwreck simile. Not him, her. For 20 years she has been the one drowning. A bed rooted in a living tree, growing out of the ground, unmovable. That is what he chose over immortality. A marriage that is literally rooted, in one place, in soil, in a house built around a tree. She has out-tested the great tester. He accepted her interview, and she trapped him with a piece of furniture. And afterwards, Homer says, Athena held back the dawn at the edge of the world, and lengthened the night for them, so that they could lie there and tell one another everything. She tells him about the suitors, all of it, everything she endured. He tells her about the Cyclopes and Circe and the Sirens and the dead, all of it, in order. And Homer actually summarizes the entire poem in miniature as they talk, and neither of them sleeps until it is done. That is the reunion, not an embrace on a beach. Two exhausted people in the dark, catching up. There is one question left, and it is the largest one, and it is the only mystery in this documentary that has genuinely never been solved. Who wrote this? For most of history, the answer was easy. Homer wrote it, a blind poet from Ionia, from Chios or Smyrna, who also wrote the Iliad, and about whom 7 different cities in antiquity claimed to be the birthplace, which is usually a sign that nobody actually knew. Doubts began early. Even in antiquity there were scholars, nicknamed the separators, who argued that one man could not have written both poems, because the Iliad and the Odyssey feel so different. And they do. The Iliad is hot and tight and terrible, 40-something days outside one city, everything compressed. The Odyssey is cool and wide and sly, 10 years and half a sea, with a taste for disguise and dinner parties and household detail. Longinus, in the 1st century, said elegantly that the Odyssey reads like the work of the same great poet in old age, the sun still large but with less of its heat. Then in 1795, a German scholar named Friedrich August Wolff published a book arguing that the poems could not have been composed as unities at all, because writing was not in use in Greece at the time. He proposed that they were assembled out of shorter oral songs, stitched together much later. That launched what became known as the Homeric question, and for 130 years the field fought about it, splitting into those who saw a single author and those who saw a committee of centuries. And then, in the 1930s, a young American went to Yugoslavia with a recording machine. His name was Milman Parry. He had noticed something about the Homeric text that everyone had seen and nobody had properly explained, which is that it is full of repeated phrases: rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea, swift-footed Achilles, gray-eyed Athena. Whole lines and half-lines recur hundreds of times. Parry realized these were not decorations. They were tools. Each epithet fits a specific metrical slot in the dactylic hexameter line. A poet composing at speed, out loud, in front of an audience, needs ready-made pieces that fit the rhythm perfectly and can be dropped in while he thinks about what comes next. The system is astonishingly economical. For almost any character, in almost any grammatical case, there is one and only one standard phrase of the right length. That is not how a man writes at a desk. That is how a man performs. To prove it, Parry and his assistant Albert Lord went to look for living oral poets and found them in the mountains of Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro, illiterate singers called guslari, who performed enormous heroic songs from memory, accompanied on a one-stringed fiddle. Parry recorded them, thousands of lines, on aluminium discs. He found singers who could perform for hours, who could hear a song once and reproduce it at similar length, and who used exactly the same kind of formulaic building blocks. Crucially, they did not memorize a fixed text. They composed a new performance each time, out of traditional materials, and would insist afterwards that they had sung it word for word the same. One singer, Avdo Medvedevich, produced a song of some 12,000 lines, roughly the length of the Odyssey. Parry died in 1935, at 33, from an accidental gunshot in a hotel room in Los Angeles. Lord carried the work on and published The Singer of Tales in 1960, and it changed the field permanently. So the modern consensus, insofar as there is one, runs something like this. Behind these poems lies a tradition of oral heroic song stretching back centuries, quite possibly with roots reaching the Mycenaean age itself. That tradition preserved genuine fossils. The boar's tusk helmet described in the Iliad, made from dozens of slivers of tusk sewn to a leather cap, had not been made for 400 years when the poem was written down, and was known only from poetry until archaeologists dug one up and found it matched the description exactly. The great tower-like body shield, the silver-studded sword, place names of cities that were ruins by the 8th century. Then, at some point in the 8th or early 7th century before the Common Era, alphabetic writing arrives in Greece, borrowed from the Phoenicians and adapted with vowels, and something happens. Somebody made these particular versions. Somebody shaped a tradition of loose episodic material into two enormous, structured, artistically deliberate poems, with a plan. The Odyssey's structure is not accidental. Starting in the middle, holding the hero off stage for 4 books, putting the wildest adventures inside a story told by an unreliable narrator at a dinner party, ending not with the killing but with a reconciliation, that is design. Whether that somebody dictated it to a scribe, or wrote it himself, or was a family of singers on Chios called the Homeridae, who claimed descent from him, or was 2 different people a generation apart, we cannot say, and probably never will. What has changed in recent decades is that scholars are increasingly willing to say the poems are the work of genuine authorial intelligence, whoever that was, working within an oral tradition rather than in spite of it. Statistical and linguistic analysis has found the 2 poems remarkably consistent internally, more consistent than the old analysts expected. And there is one more possibility that deserves a mention, because it has grown from a fringe idea to a respectable minority position. Samuel Butler, better known for his novels, proposed in 1897 that the Odyssey was written by a woman. His arguments were partly whimsical and partly not. The extraordinary interiority given to female characters, the domestic precision, the fact that Nausicaa is portrayed with such affection and knows so much about laundry, the relative haziness of some of the seafaring detail against the sharpness of the household detail. Robert Graves later wrote a novel around the idea. No serious scholar accepts the specific claim, but the observation underneath it, that this poem is unusually and genuinely interested in women's lives and women's minds, has proved durable and is now widely discussed. What we can say for certain is this: the words you have been listening to tonight, in translation and in paraphrase and in my own rearranging, began as sound. They were made to be spoken aloud, in the dark, in a hall, to people who had eaten and drunk and were settling down, with a fire going low in the middle of the room. They were designed, from the very beginning, to be listened to at night by people who were tired, which is, more or less, exactly what we have been doing. The poem does not quite end there, and it is worth knowing how it actually finishes, because the last movement is very quiet. Odysseus goes up into the hills, in the morning, to find his father. He finds an old man in a filthy patched tunic, and stitched leather gaiters and gloves against the brambles, and a goatskin cap, digging round a young tree, alone, deliberately making himself as wretched as possible, because that is what his grief has become. And Odysseus, who cannot help himself, tests him too. He tells him another lie, a story about meeting his son years ago in another country, and he watches his own father take up handfuls of ash and pour them over his white head, and only then does he give it up and say, "I am here, and I am your son." It is the last test he ever runs on anybody, and it is the one he should not have run, and he knows it, and Homer lets you see him realize it. Then the families come for revenge, and Athena stops it, and the poem ends on the word peace. So, why does this thing survive? There is a practical answer, and a profound one. The practical answer is that the Odyssey has been continuously copied, taught, quoted, argued about, and translated for very nearly 3,000 years, which is a longer unbroken chain than almost anything else in Western culture. It was already a school text in classical Athens. It shaped Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, as a deliberate answer to it. It reached the Middle Ages mostly through Latin filters, came roaring back with the Greek manuscripts that arrived in Italy in the 15th century, and has never gone away since. Chapman translated it, and Keats wrote a sonnet about the shock of reading that translation. Pope translated it. Tennyson wrote his own restless Ulysses, an old king who cannot bear the quiet and sails again. Joyce mapped the entire thing onto a single day in Dublin. Derek Walcott moved it to the Caribbean and won a Nobel Prize. Margaret Atwood retold it from Penelope's side and gave the 12 hanged women a chorus. Madeline Miller wrote Circe her own life. There have been films, operas, a Coen Brothers musical comedy set in Mississippi, and the word Odyssey itself, which now simply means any long transformative journey, and is used by people who have never read a line of it. That is the practical answer. It survived because it kept being useful. The profound answer is that it was the first story to understand that going home is harder than leaving. Almost every heroic narrative before and since is about departure. The young man leaves, the young man is tested, the young man triumphs. The Odyssey is about the other half, the half nobody writes about, and it is honest in a way that is almost shocking, because he does not arrive home to what he left. Nobody ever does. His mother is dead of grief. His father has broken down. His dog dies at his feet. His son is a stranger with a beard. His household has been eaten. The men he took with him are all at the bottom of the sea, 600 of them, and every single one died because of a decision he made or failed to make. And his wife, who he has been thinking about for 2 decades, does not run into his arms, because she has had 20 years of her own, and she needs to be sure. That is what coming back is like. Anyone who has been away, really away, at a war, or at sea, or in a hospital, or simply inside a long, hard stretch of their own life, will recognize every part of it. Veterans read this poem. It is used in programs for returning soldiers, and the classicist Jonathan Shea wrote an entire book about it, arguing that the Odyssey is, among other things, an accurate account of what we now call combat trauma and the difficulty of coming back into ordinary life. The man who cannot stop lying, the man who cannot trust his crew, the man who sits on a beach in paradise with his back to it, weeping, looking at the sea. And that leads to the last thing, and then I will let you go. Look at what he is actually offered over the course of this story, and what he turns down. He is offered forgetting, on the island of the Lotus, and refuses it. He is offered comfort with Circe, and takes it for a year, and then leaves. He is offered total knowledge by the Sirens, and has himself tied up so that he cannot accept. He is offered eternal life and eternal youth, and a beautiful goddess on a beautiful island, where nothing bad will ever happen again. And he sits on the rocks and cries and says no, every day, for 7 years. And what he asks for instead is a rocky island where the ground is poor and the wind never stops. A house he built himself, an old dog, a mortal wife who will grow old, a son he has to get to know from scratch, and eventually to die there, in a peaceful old age, with his people around him. He chooses the small real thing over the enormous perfect one. That is the whole poem. That is why it lasted. And the last prophecy, remember, is the strangest and most beautiful. He must take an oar and walk inland until he meets somebody who does not know what it is. Until he finds a place where the sea, which took everything from him, means nothing at all and is just a word, and where he can put the thing down. Then go home and live and die gently from the sea, in old age, with his people prospering around him. That is what was promised him. A long, quiet ending, in his own bed, in a house built around a tree. We have come a very long way tonight. We began on a beach below a burning city, with the smoke going up in a thin grey line, and a man standing in the stern of a ship, trying to remember what his son looked like. And we have followed him past the edge of every map, through fog and giants and enchantment and the country of the dead, and out the other side, and home. If you are still with me, thank you. And if you drifted off somewhere around the Cyclopes, or in Circe's house with the fire low, or hanging from that fig tree above the whirlpool, then that is perfect. That is what this was for. Let the ancient world go now. Let the ship go. Let the sound of the oars fade out into the dark and become just the sound of your own breathing, slow and easy, going in and out like water on a shore. Here is what I keep coming back to, and then we are done. Everything in that story is gone. The palaces burned. The kingdoms fell within a century of the events they describe. The language they were written in changed beyond recognition, twice. Troy became a mound of earth that farmers plowed around for 3,000 years without knowing what it was. Mycenae is a hillside of stones. Pylos is a floor plan. The people are gone. Every single one of them. Kings and slaves and swineherds and princesses doing the laundry at the river mouth. All of them, ash and dust for 100 generations. And the story is still here. Somebody, a very long time ago, sat in a hall in the firelight and told it. And somebody heard it and told it again. And it passed from mouth to mouth, through a dark age when nobody in Greece could write at all, for 400 years, carried entirely in the memories of people whose names we will never know. And it came out the other side intact. That is the real message under all of it, I think. Kingdoms go, empires go. Everything anybody ever built out of stone comes down eventually. But a story told well enough, about something true enough, will get carried, hand to hand, voice to voice, across the collapse of the world that made it. We are the shore it finally washed up on. Thank you for spending these hours with me. Thank you to everyone who suggested this one after we spent that long night beneath the walls of Troy. And thank you, sincerely, to everyone who subscribes, who comments, who tells me where in the world they are listening from, and what the time is where they are. It genuinely makes this possible. If you would like to take a little of this with you, Sleep into Power is available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. These documentaries are on Spotify as well. And if you ever feel like supporting the channel directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee page, and every one of those means a great deal. Leave a comment if you would like to tell me where we should go next. Almost everything on this channel started as somebody's suggestion. Sleep well now. The ship is at anchor. The fire in the hall has burned down to embers. Somewhere on a rocky island in the Ionian Sea, an exhausted man and a woman who waited 20 years for him are lying in a bed rooted to the earth, and the dawn is being held back a little longer, just for them. Rest, until our next journey through history. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.